She planned a birthday for 40 people. Not one showed up. Then a stranger walked in and changed everything. If you've ever been betrayed by the people you trusted most, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what starts with 40 empty chairs becomes something neither of them ever saw coming. Hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The reservation had been made 6 weeks in advance. Sienna Whitmore had been precise about everything. The way she was precise about everything, down to the thread count of her conference room chairs and the exact temperature her morning coffee needed to be before she'd take a first sip. She'd called the restaurant personally, not through her assistant, which was unusual enough that her assistant had mentioned it twice. She'd chosen the private dining room on the 3rd floor of Aldrich's, a place with tall windows that looked out over the city's financial district like a painting someone had commissioned specifically to make ambitious people feel at home. She'd ordered a tasting menu for 40 guests. She'd selected the wine herself. She'd even picked the flower arrangement. White ranunculus, no baby's breath, nothing fussy. She had planned this birthday the way she used to plan product launches. She was turning 30, and she had decided that mattered. The accident had happened 11 months ago. 11 months of surgeries and hospital rooms that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, of physical therapy sessions that left her wrist shaking and her jaw tight from the effort of not making noise when things hurt, of learning how to move through a world that had been designed, she now understood viscerally, for people whose bodies worked differently than hers. 11 months of fielding calls from board members who spoke to her in a tone she'd never heard directed at her before, careful, measured, the way people talked to someone they weren't sure could still handle things. She could handle things. She had always been able to handle things. So she'd planned this birthday as a statement, not a party. She didn't want a party. She wanted a dinner with the 40 people who mattered most in her professional life, in a room that said, "I'm still here," because apparently that needed to be said out loud in a way that 40 expensive place settings could communicate more clearly than any memo. That had been the idea anyway. Sienna arrived at Aldrich's at 6:15, 45 minutes before the reservation time. She told herself it was so she could check that the room was set up correctly. That was mostly true. The maitre d' met her at the entrance with the particular combination of warmth and professional neutrality that good restaurants trained into their staff. His name was Henri, and he'd seated her here maybe a dozen times over the past 4 years. He didn't react to the wheelchair, which she appreciated. Some people froze. Some people overcorrected and became extremely helpful in a way that made her want to throw something. "Ms. Whitmore," he smiled. "The room is ready." The elevator was at the far left of the lobby. She knew where it was. The private dining room on the 3rd floor was long and narrow, with the tall windows she'd remembered and a table that could seat 40 comfortably. The florist had come through. White ranunculus, no baby's breath, small arrangements spaced down the center of the table. The glasses caught the light. The napkins were folded into crisp standing rectangles. It looked like exactly what she'd envisioned. She did a slow pass of the room, checking things without admitting to herself that she was checking things. And then she took her position at the head of the table, faced the door, and waited. At 7 o'clock, the first guests were supposed to arrive. No one came through the door. She assumed traffic. The financial district on a Friday evening was genuinely terrible, and 40 people coming from 40 different directions meant 40 different traffic situations. She took a sip of water. She checked her phone. There was a message from her assistant, "Everything okay?" That she didn't answer because the answer was obviously yes, everything was fine, people were just running a few minutes late. At 7:15, the maitre d' came by to ask if she'd like to begin with anything while she waited. She said she was fine. He nodded and retreated. She noticed he didn't ask about the other guests. At 7:30, she checked her phone again. Nothing. No texts saying running late, be there soon, no calls. Nothing from 40 different people who all apparently had the same Friday evening traffic situation. She opened her texts and found the last message from Dana Feller, who was her VP of product, and also, she'd thought, a friend. The kind of friend that developed over years of shared stress and 11 p.m. problem-solving sessions. The last message from Dana was 3 days ago, confirming she'd be there. She typed, "Hey, just checking in. We're at Aldrich's." She deleted it, started over. "Hey, dinner's started." "You on your way?" She sent it and put her phone face down on the table. At 7:45, she turned the phone back over. Dana had seen it. The two gray check marks had gone blue. No response. Sienna set the phone down again, very carefully, the way she set things down when she was working to keep her hands from doing something else. The candles in the middle of the table were lit. The wine was breathing in the decanters. The ranunculus were perfect. All 40 place settings were arranged with mathematical precision, the forks at exactly the right angle, the glasses spotless. From the doorway, the room looked ready for an event. From where she was sitting, at the head of the table with 39 empty chairs stretching away from her, it looked like something else. She thought about texting other people. She didn't. She thought about calling her assistant, asking her to find out what was happening. She didn't do that either. What she did was sit there, in the silence of a room that was set for 40 people and occupied by one, and she kept her face completely neutral the way she'd learned to keep her face neutral in board meetings when someone said something that made her want to put her fist through a wall. She was good at that. She'd been doing it for years. You didn't build a billion-dollar company at 26 without getting very good at keeping your face neutral while the inside of your chest did something complicated. It was 5 minutes past 8 when she heard footsteps on the stairs. She looked at the door, straightened almost instinctively. The man who appeared in the doorway was not one of her 40 guests. He was maybe 6 feet tall, with the kind of build that suggested someone who used to work with his hands, not a gym build, just solid in a functional way, like he carried things regularly. He was wearing a dark blue jacket that had been pressed recently, but not recently enough. The collar slightly uneven in the way that happened when you iron something yourself at 7 in the morning in a hurry. He was maybe 30, 32 at most. He had a girl with him, small, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with her hair in 2 uneven pigtails that suggested she'd had some input into the styling process and overruled whoever had tried to help. The girl was holding his hand and looking at the room with wide eyes, the way kids looked at things that were more formal than their usual environments. The man looked at Sienna. He looked at the 40 empty chairs. He looked back at Sienna. He seemed to do a quick internal calculation. "I'm sorry," he said. "I think we might have the wrong floor. We had a reservation downstairs and then Lily decided she needed to use the restroom and we ended up..." He glanced back at the hallway, then at the room again. "This is the private dining room, isn't it?" "Yes." "We definitely have the wrong floor." He started to turn. "The restaurant's on the 2nd floor," Sienna said. "Take the elevator back down." "Right." He nodded. Then he paused. He looked at the room again, at the candles and the untouched wine and the 39 empty chairs. And then he looked at her, and she watched him figure out something that she had not intended to be figured out. She kept her face neutral. The little girl, Lily, was looking at the flowers. "Those are pretty," Lily said. She wasn't talking to her father or to Sienna specifically. She was just making an observation about the world, the way small children did. "They're ranunculus," Sienna said. "White ones." Lily considered this. "They look like roses, but fluffier." "That's a good description." The man, the father, was still standing in the doorway. He had a look on his face that she couldn't quite read. Not pity. She would have recognized pity and reacted accordingly. It was something more like consideration, like he was weighing something. "I know this isn't my business," he said, "and if you'd rather I take her back downstairs, I completely understand, but..." He stopped, tried again. "She's been asking me all week if we could sit at a fancy table for her birthday dinner." Sienna looked at the girl. "It's your birthday?" Lily nodded solemnly. "I'm 6. Sienna looked at the 39 empty chairs. She looked at the 2 people standing in her doorway. "Would you mind if we sat with you?" he asked. It was such a simple question. No performance in it, no pity, no calculation, just a question. "No," Sienna said after a moment. "I don't mind." His name was Ethan Calloway. He told her that while he was helping Lily into a chair, the chair immediately to Sienna's left, which Lily had chosen with the seriousness of someone selecting real estate and trying to make sure she didn't knock over the floral arrangement, which she definitely came close to doing twice. "Sorry about her," he said, settling into the chair beside his daughter. "She's fine," Sienna said. And she was. Lily had the kind of confidence that some small children had, the confidence of someone who had not yet learned to be uncertain about whether they deserved to take up space. Ethan Calloway. He reached across and offered his hand. His grip was firm without being performative. Sienna Whitmore. Something shifted slightly in his expression, just briefly. Recognition, maybe, or something adjacent to it. It was gone before she could parse it. "Happy birthday," he said. She almost said "it's not my birthday," and then remembered that it was. She'd been sitting at this table for over an hour, and she'd managed to largely stop thinking about what the night was supposed to be. "Thank you." "You too," Lily said to Sienna, very seriously. "Lily," Ethan said. "What?" "It might be her birthday too." "It is, actually," Sienna said. Lily seemed enormously pleased by this. "We're birthday twins," she announced. "We have to share cake." "We don't have to," Ethan started. "We're getting cake," Lily informed him, in the tone of someone who had already decided. The sommelier appeared and looked at the two unexpected guests with exactly the right level of professional composure. Sienna requested a wine glass for Ethan and apple juice for Lily, and the sommelier retreated without comment because Aldrich's paid their staff enough to handle unexpected changes in guest composition without visible reaction. Sienna watched Ethan take in the room, the candles, the untouched settings stretching down the long table, the 40 arrangements of silverware. He was doing it quietly, not making a show of looking, but she'd been reading rooms full of people for over a decade, and she could tell when someone was assembling a picture. "You work in tech?" he asked. "Mobility technology. My company makes advanced wheelchairs, exoskeletons, assistive movement systems." She paused. "I'm the CEO. "Vantage Motion," he said. "Not a question." "You know it." "I know the Series D." He said it like someone who had spent time around financial news but not inside it. "And the flagship product announcement last spring, the Apex prototype." He picked up his wine glass, turned it slightly. "I used to be an engineer." "Used to be?" "Gave it up about 4 years ago." He said it simply, no particular weight on it. "I'm in consulting now, small projects mostly, flexible hours." She didn't ask the obvious follow-up question, which was why. She had a reasonably good hypothesis, looking at Lily, who was currently reorganizing the silverware in front of her into what appeared to be a more logical arrangement. They ordered. The waiter, a young man named Marco, who Sienna had dealt with before, took their orders with complete calm, made a minor recommendation about the lamb that Ethan took, and left. Lily ordered something called the small plates for small people, which was not technically on the menu, but which Marco said he'd see what could be arranged. "He's going to bring her what amounts to the entire appetizer menu, isn't he?" Ethan said when Marco had gone. "Probably," Sienna agreed. "She does this everywhere." He didn't sound annoyed by it exactly, more like someone who had made peace with a recurring phenomenon. "Sounds useful," Sienna said. "Negotiation is a skill." "She's 6. Good foundation." He looked at her, and there was something like amusement in it, careful and real at the same time. "You've always been in business?" "Since I was 22. I built the first version of the Apex system as a graduate thesis." She picked up her water glass. "It was terrible. The weight distribution was wrong, and the haptic feedback gave users headaches. Took me 2 more years to get it right. And then you found investors." "And then I found investors who were willing to bet on a 24-year-old with a heavy prototype and a very detailed slide deck." She paused. "Most of them told me to come back in 5 years. I found the ones who didn't." "How many of them regret it now?" "None of them will admit to it, which is functionally the same thing." She took a sip of wine. "Why did you leave engineering?" She hadn't meant to ask it directly. It came out before she'd decided to ask it. He didn't seem bothered. He glanced at Lily, who was examining her fork with the focus of a quality control inspector, and then back at Sienna. "Lily's mother left when she was 14 months old. I was working 70-hour weeks at a firm in Seattle. That stopped making sense." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It worked out." He said it like he'd answered this question before and arrived at genuine peace with the answer through repetition. "She's a reasonably functional 6-year-old. "I heard that," Lily said without looking up from her fork. "I know you did," Ethan said. The food came. It was extraordinary, as it always was at Aldrich's, but the kind of cooking that made you slow down against your will because the flavor was too specific to rush through. Lily received what did, in fact, amount to most of the appetizer menu, arranged on small plates across the section of table in front of her, and she worked through it with serious dedication. Sienna ate and realized she was unexpectedly not thinking about the empty chairs. She noticed this the way you noticed a headache stopping. In retrospect, the absence of something that had been there. Ethan ate the lamb, which was correct of him because it was excellent. He asked her questions, real ones, not the kind people asked at industry events to seem interested before pivoting to what they actually wanted. He asked about the engineering challenges of building adaptive mobility systems, about what the feedback from users had told her that the data hadn't, about what she thought the field would look like in 10 years. He listened to her answers in the way that engineers listened, not waiting for a gap to speak, actually processing what she was saying. At some point, he mentioned the Apex prototype. Specifically, he mentioned having read the technical brief she'd published in March, the one that had generated 3 times the usual traffic on their website because the approach to sensor integration was, by general consensus in the field, genuinely innovative. The dynamic load compensation, he said, worked differently than I expected. From the brief, I assumed you were using passive adjustment, but when I saw the demo footage from the trade show, active adjustment with a half-second predictive window, she said. The passive approach gave us vibration issues on incline transitions. That tracks. He nodded, turning his wine glass. What's the failure mode when the predictive window miscalculates? It hasn't miscalculated in 40,000 test hours. But when it does, she looked at him. The safety system defaults to passive mode and the user gets a notification. 2-second transition. 2 seconds is long on an incline. We know, we're working on it. She set her fork down. What are you actually asking? He was quiet for a moment, like he was deciding something. I watched the full demo footage. All of it. There's a section, about 40 minutes in, where the test unit goes through the graded obstacle course. Between the 3rd and 4th obstacles, the chair makes a micro-correction that doesn't track with the terrain data in the brief. Sienna looked at him for a long second. I know the section you're talking about. The brief explains it as a calibration artifact. That's what the brief says. Is that what it is? She studied him. The question wasn't hostile. It wasn't even particularly probing. It was the question of someone who'd spent years looking at things that didn't quite line up and knew the difference between a calibration artifact and something else. The full analysis is in an internal document, she said carefully. The brief is the public-facing version. Right. He nodded slowly. I don't have access to the internal document, obviously. I'm just... He stopped. It looked different to me. That's all. Lily had finished approximately 70% of her appetizer collection and was now leaning against her father's arm with the slow, inevitable weight of a child running out of fuel. Ethan put his arm around her automatically, the gesture so ingrained it looked like breathing. What kind of consulting do you do now? Sienna asked. Product safety, mostly. I look at things and tell people what I see. And what do you see? He looked at her steadily. I see a prototype that's almost perfect, and I think almost is the part you should be paying attention to. They stayed until 9:30. By that point, Lily had fallen most of the way asleep in her chair, held upright by Ethan's arm and the structural support of the chair back, a piece of bread still loosely held in one hand. Ethan and Sienna had moved somewhere in the middle of the second course from cautious questions to something more like conversation, the kind that moved sideways, following its own logic, from mobility systems to the specific difficulty of building hardware in an industry dominated by software investors, to the difference between being respected and being trusted, and whether those were actually related at all. At one point, Sienna said something that made him laugh, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded. And she noticed it because she'd been in enough rooms with enough people who laughed at things she said specifically to demonstrate that they found her impressive. And this didn't sound like that. It sounded like something she'd actually gotten out of him. When he finally moved to go, gathering the half-asleep Lily into his arms with practiced ease, Sienna signaled Marco for the check. You don't have to... Ethan started. "It's my birthday," she said, "and apparently yours too." She looked at Lily, whose eyes were fully closed now, her cheek against her father's shoulder. He smiled. It was a slightly tired smile, and it fit his face well. "Thank you," he said. "For the chairs." "You asked nicely," she said. He was at the door when she said, "Ethan." He turned. "The micro-correction on the obstacle course. You said it looked different to you." She paused. "Different how?" He seemed to think about how to say it. Like it was compensating for something that shouldn't have needed compensating for. Like something underneath wasn't quite right. He said goodnight and walked out with his daughter, and Sienna sat for a moment at the head of the long table among 40 sets of silverware and the slow guttering candles and the perfect white ranunculus. And she thought about what underneath might mean. Balkan. She didn't go home right away, she went to the office. This was not unusual. She'd been going to the office late at night for years. There was a particular quality to the building after midnight, when the open floor plan was empty and the city lights came through the glass walls and everything was quiet enough that she could actually think. She'd made some of her best decisions in this building after midnight. Her access card still worked. She hadn't checked, until now, whether she'd half expected it not to. The elevators were fast at this hour. She went up to the 7th floor, where the engineering division's main workspace stretched out in organized sections. Hardware bays, testing rigs, prototype storage along the far wall. The lighting was on the overnight setting, dim except for the safety strips along the floor. She went to the prototype bay. The Apex unit was there, in its charging dock, alongside the 2 secondary test units and the modified version they'd been running for the external safety trials. Everything looked as it should. Everything looked exactly as it should. She moved closer to the primary unit, pulled up the data interface on the workstation beside it, keyed in her credentials, and opened the test logs. She went to the obstacle course session, found the timestamp for the 3rd to 4th obstacle section, pulled the raw sensor data, not the processed version that had gone into the brief, the raw data from the primary sensors. She looked at it for a while. Then she pulled up the safety systems architecture file, which she hadn't looked at in 3 weeks because she'd been dealing with board communications and legal reviews and the increasingly irritating quarterly projections process, and she cross-referenced the sensor data against the system parameters. The anomaly was small. If you were looking for a calibration artifact, you could read it as one. If you were not looking for a calibration artifact, you might read it as evidence that a compensatory routine was running in a component that was not, according to the architecture file, supposed to have a compensatory routine. It was 1:17 in the morning. Sienna saved a copy of the raw data to her personal directory, locked the workstation, and left the building. She sat in her car for a minute in the parking structure. The overhead lights hummed. Outside, the city was still doing what cities did at 1 a.m. The steady presence of light and movement and people who had somewhere to be or nowhere to be and no particular urgency about it. She found Ethan Calloway's name in her phone. She'd put it in there at the end of dinner when they'd exchanged numbers in the casual way that sometimes happened at the end of unexpectedly decent evenings, with no particular plan attached. She didn't text him. Not yet. She sat in the car in the parking structure and thought about what underneath meant, and about the compensatory routine running in a component that wasn't supposed to have one, and about 11 months of hospitals and recycled air and people talking to her in a new, careful tone. She thought about the 40 empty seats, about Dana Feller's message, opened and unanswered, about the way the room had looked when she'd first seen it, set for 40, occupied by one. Then she thought about the simple way Ethan had asked, "Would you mind if we sat with you? No calculation, no pity, just a question." She pulled out of the parking structure and drove home. She had things to look at in the morning, things that needed looking at. The text started coming in at 8 a.m. Not from the 40 people who hadn't shown up. She'd closed herself off to expecting anything from that direction. These were from 3 people: her assistant Kelly, her outside legal counsel Marcus Webb, and her head of corporate communications, a woman named Joelle Park, who had been with the company since year 2, and who did not, as a rule, text on Saturday mornings unless something was on fire. Kelly: "Have you checked your sent folder? Something's weird." Marcus: "Call me when you're up, not urgent, but today if possible." Joelle, someone canceled your guests last night. I just found out. It wasn't from our office. Sienna read all three messages. Then she poured herself coffee and read them again. She called Joelle first. I was looking at the event logistics this morning, Joelle said, picking up on the first ring, which meant she'd been waiting. It's my job to make sure major executive events go smoothly. I have no excuse for not flagging this sooner. She said it like someone who had been beating themselves up about something for the past hour. I found a batch of cancellation emails. They went out to all 40 guests on Thursday evening. They looked like they came from your executive calendar system. But they didn't. They did not come from anyone in our office. I've already talked to Kelly. The originating account was spoofed to look like a standard system notification from your calendar, but the sending server is external. Someone sent fake cancellation messages to all 40 guests. Yes, a beat. Sienna, I'm so sorry. I should have... Don't. Sienna set her coffee mug down. Was there anything in the message? Any content besides a cancellation notice? Standard regrets language. Very convincing. Said the dinner had to be postponed due to scheduling conflicts and that you'd be in touch. And none of them thought to check with me directly. A pause. The message was sent from what appeared to be an official company account. Most people would take that at face value. Sienna thought about Dana Feller, about the message opened and not answered. 40 people who'd received what looked like an official cancellation, and not one of them had picked up a phone to ask if she was okay. That was a different problem. A problem for later. Forward me everything you have, Sienna said. The headers, the originating data, all of it. Already sent. She hung up and called Marcus. Marcus Webb was 62, had been a corporate litigator for 30 years, and had the specific quality of never sounding alarmed even when he was, which she'd come to find deeply useful. You're up early for a Saturday, he said. I'm always up early. She was already opening her laptop. What did you find? I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was reviewing a document for the Apex regulatory filing that your team sent me Thursday. Standard review. Nothing unusual. He paused. I found a discrepancy in the safety compliance section. Some parameters I was familiar with from the original specs don't match what's in this filing. What kind of discrepancy? The component threshold data for the primary balance sensors. The values in this filing are different from what was certified in the original testing documentation. He said it carefully, like he was watching to see how it landed. I could be looking at a clerical error, but I wanted to flag it before I assumed anything. Sienna was very still. Which components? She asked. He told her. They were the same components she'd been looking at 1 a.m. in the engineering bay. The same components she'd found the anomalous compensatory routine in. Marcus, she said, don't file anything yet. Hold everything related to Apex. Already on pause, he said. What are you thinking? I'm thinking I need a few days. She paused. And I need to talk to someone. She texted Ethan at 9 a.m. This is Sienna, from last night. Are you free this weekend? I need a second set of eyes on something. He answered in 4 minutes. Free this afternoon. What's the something? The thing underneath, she typed. I looked at the data last night. I think you were right. A longer pause this time. Send me the file. I'll look before I come in. She pulled the raw sensor data from her personal directory and sent it through an encrypted transfer. She sat with her coffee and watched the city out her window, the Saturday morning version of it. Slower, more human, people with dogs and coffee cups, the world operating at a different rhythm. Her phone buzzed. I'm looking at this now. Where did you get the raw data? Direct from the prototype bay last night. Another pause. Sienna, this isn't a calibration artifact. She already knew that. She'd known it at 1 a.m. in the parking structure. She'd known it, maybe, since Ethan had said something underneath wasn't quite right, and something in her had heard the words like an echo of something she'd already been carrying. I know, she typed back. Come to the office at 3. Use the side entrance. She put the phone down and looked at the city. Somewhere in the architecture of her company, in the systems and files and processes that she'd built from nothing, that she'd spent 8 years constructing into something real, something had been altered. Not by accident. Not by a calibration error or a clerical mistake. By someone who had access. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The 40 empty chairs, the spoofed cancellation emails, the modified safety parameters in the regulatory filing. 3 separate things, or one thing, seen from 3 different angles. She thought about the board meetings she'd sat through since coming back, the careful tones, the slightly too long pauses when she made decisions. She thought about her cousin Brandon, who had been running day-to-day operations while she was in the hospital, who had been, according to everyone, an enormous help during a very difficult time. She thought about her accident, about the component report that had come back clean, the investigation that had found no manufacturing defect, no systemic failure, just an unfortunate sequence of circumstances. She opened her laptop and pulled up the original accident investigation report. She started at the beginning and read every word. By noon, she had 3 pages of notes and a very quiet, very certain feeling about what she was going to find when she and Ethan started looking in earnest. Outside her window, the city moved through its Saturday at a human pace, unhurried. She sat at her desk and read and thought and waited for 3 o'clock to come. He arrived at the side entrance at 2:54. He was wearing different clothes than the night before, a gray pullover, dark jeans, a jacket that actually fit him properly this time. He looked like someone who had spent the morning thinking, which she suspected he had. "Where's Lily?" she asked as she let him in. "My neighbor's watching her. She has a thing for Saturday cartoons, and apparently my neighbor has a better streaming setup than I do." He looked around the lobby. "I've never been inside the building before." "Come on up." In the elevator, he said, "The compensatory routine in the secondary sensor cluster, I looked at it for 2 hours this morning. It's not a firmware patch. It's a manual override inserted into the base code." "I know. Someone put it there on purpose." "I know that too." He looked at her. "Who has access to the base code?" "6 people," she said, "including me." The elevator opened. She led him into the engineering bay. "Let me show you what I found in the regulatory filing," she said. He looked at everything she showed him, the sensor data, the discrepant safety parameters, the sections of the accident investigation report she'd flagged. He looked at it all with the systematic attention of someone trained to follow chains of causality, not jumping to conclusions but not dismissing anything either. At some point, he sat back in the workstation chair and looked at the ceiling for a long second. "How long have you known something was wrong?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Some part of me, since the accident. I didn't let myself go there because I didn't have anything concrete to stand on." She paused. "Now I have something." He looked at her. "You need a lawyer." "I have one." "And you need someone you trust completely, not professionally, actually completely." She thought about the 40 empty chairs, about Dana Feller's message, opened and not answered. She thought about which people she would have called an hour before last night and where she'd rank them now. "That's a shorter list than it used to be," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You have me, if you want." He said it like a practical statement, not a declaration of anything. "I'm not connected to this company. I don't have a stake in the outcome except that I can look at a data file and tell you what I actually see." She looked at him, at the tired, careful face of someone who had made a different set of choices than she had, for different reasons, and who had shown up at a private dining room on the wrong floor with his daughter and asked a very simple question. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We haven't found everything." He turned back to the workstation. She turned to face the screen beside him. Outside the glass walls, the city was bright in the afternoon light, moving through its Saturday. Inside, they started at the beginning and worked forward, following the thread wherever it led, because someone had been very careful, and that meant the evidence was there, buried, waiting for 2 people who were willing to look. They worked until the light changed. They worked until nearly 7 that Saturday evening, and by the time Ethan pushed back from the workstation and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands, they had 4 separate documents open on 2 screens and a handwritten list on the back of a printed engineering spec that Sienna had found in the desk drawer. The list had 11 items on it. Not all 11 were confirmed. Some were questions. Some were the kind of thing that looked like evidence until you looked at it from a different angle. And then it looked like coincidence. And then you looked at it from the original angle again, and it stopped looking like coincidence. But the shape of it was there, the outline of something deliberate, something that had been running underneath the visible surface of the company for longer than either of them wanted to think about. "I need to eat something," Ethan said. I think better when I've eaten. There's a place 2 blocks over that delivers. Order whatever you usually get. He stood, stretched, walked to the window. The city had shifted into evening mode. The quality of the light different. The traffic below moving with the particular density of a Saturday night starting up. Tell me about Brandon. Sienna had been waiting for this question, not dreading it exactly, but aware it was coming the way you were aware of weather. Brandon Whitmore, he's my cousin. Technically second cousin. Our fathers were cousins. She pulled up her phone and ordered food on autopilot. He's been with the company 8 years, joined 2 years after I founded it. His role? Chief Operating Officer. He ran day-to-day for 3 years, then I moved him to strategic development when I hired a dedicated COO from outside. She set the phone down. He wasn't happy about that. He didn't say it directly, but you don't spend 8 years watching someone and miss the signals. And when you were in the hospital. He stepped in. He ran operations for 11 months. She paused. The board was grateful. He was steady, he was visible, he communicated well. Everyone said he handled it beautifully. Ethan had his back to her, still looking at the window. How much access did he have to the engineering systems while you were out? Full access. Emergency authorization. I signed the paperwork from the hospital 2 days after the accident. He turned around. You gave him full access. I was in surgery twice in the first week. Someone had to run the company. He didn't say anything to that, which was the right call. There wasn't anything useful to say about a decision that had made complete sense at the time and now sat differently. The manual override in the sensor cluster, she said. The access log for that code segment. I pulled it this afternoon. It was modified 4 times in the past 14 months. My credentials show twice, which tracks with legitimate development work I remember doing. There are 2 other entries. Who? The log shows a senior engineering account, Dylan Marsh. He was lead architect on the Apex sensor integration. Was? He resigned in February, said he had a better offer. She picked up the handwritten list. I didn't think about it at the time. Senior engineers leave. It happens. Ethan came back to the desk and sat down. Did you talk to him before he left? Standard exit process, HR meeting, handoff documentation, access termination. She looked at the list. I didn't do the exit meeting personally. I was focused on the board presentation that month. Who did the meeting? She already knew the answer. She'd known it before she said the words. Brandon sat in. He said he wanted to ensure a smooth handoff of Dylan's project files. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I want to pull Dylan Marsh's access logs for the full 14 months, not just the sensor cluster, everything he touched. I can do that. And I want to look at the accident investigation report again, specifically the component analysis. Sienna opened the report on her screen without being asked. She'd been back to that section 4 times today already, reading it with different eyes each time. The findings were the same every time. No manufacturing defect, no systemic failure. The language was clean and precise, and it said exactly what it needed to say to close an investigation. The investigators, Ethan said, leaning forward. Who commissioned the report? Insurance carrier hired the firm. Standard process. Did you have independent representation in the investigation? My legal team reviewed the findings, but they didn't commission independent analysis. No. She kept her voice level. I was in the hospital, and Brandon was running operations. She looked at him. He was looking at the report, not at her. The food arrived 20 minutes later. Thai, from the place 2 blocks over that she ordered from often enough that they knew her address without being asked. They ate at the workstation with the documents still up on the screens, Ethan scrolling through Dylan Marsh's access records while he ate, Sienna going back through the accident investigation timeline. Here, Ethan said, setting down his fork. She moved closer to his screen. Dylan Marsh's engineering access log, 14 months of it. The timestamps were dense. A working engineer's pattern, consistent and distributed across work hours with occasional late-night sessions that tracked with deadline pressure. Nothing unusual. Until 6 weeks before his resignation, when the pattern changed. The late-night sessions got longer, the access points shifted, Less time in the active development environment, more time in the archived project files. And twice, at 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. on separate nights, he'd accessed a file directory that Sienna didn't immediately recognize. She leaned forward and read the directory path. "That's the pre-certification testing archive," she said slowly. "That's where we store the raw data from safety trials before products go to regulatory review." Why would a senior architect be pulling pre-certification data at 2 a.m. 6 weeks before his resignation? She didn't answer because the answer was forming itself clearly, and she needed a moment to let it settle before she said it out loud. "He found something," she said, "in the pre-certification data, something that should have stopped the Apex from going to review. And then he resigned 2 months later. Or was managed out," she said, "with help." Ethan looked at her. She looked at the screen. The timestamp read 2:14 a.m., 6 weeks before Dylan Marsh had told HR he had a better offer. What happened between 2:14 a.m. and the resignation letter was not in the access logs, but the shape of it was there, the same way the shape of the original sabotage had been there in the sensor data, outlined in absence, in the things that had been removed or altered or quietly shut down. "I need to find Dylan Marsh," Sienna said. "That's going to take some time." "I know." She picked up her phone. "But Marcus Webb can help with that. He has people." She dialed. Marcus picked up on the third ring, which for a Saturday night meant he'd been keeping his phone close. She told him what they'd found. She heard him writing things down. At the end, he said, "I'm going to be honest with you, Sienna. If what you're describing is accurate, we're not talking about internal misconduct. We're talking about criminal liability." "I know what we're talking about." "And you're sure about the source of the data? The access logs, the sensor archive? You pulled these yourself?" "Personally, tonight." A pause. "All right. I'll have someone reach out to Dylan Marsh through a personal contact. Nothing official yet. Give me until Monday." Another pause. "Sienna, be careful who else you loop in right now. If someone has been running this kind of operation inside your company for over a year, they have eyes." She hung up and looked at Ethan, who had been listening without pretending not to. "He said be careful," she said. "Smart lawyer." "He said someone has eyes." Ethan nodded slowly. "Which means whoever did this probably already knows you were in the building today." She hadn't thought about that. She thought about it now. The building's access system logged every entry. Any administrator with the right access could pull that data. She'd used her credential to get into the engineering bay. She'd accessed multiple restricted files. If someone was watching, "My building access," she said. "If Brandon, how quickly could he see it?" The logs refresh every 6 hours during off-peak times. She checked her watch. He'd have it by morning, if he looked. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, so we're working on a clock." "We were always working on a clock." She looked at the handwritten list. 11 items. And she still didn't have enough to take to the board. Not yet. Not without being dismissed as paranoid, or worse, emotionally reactive. She knew how that conversation would go. She'd sat in enough rooms to know exactly how it would go. "I need more than what we have. I need the pre-certification data Dylan accessed. I need to know what was in those files." "Can you get them?" "My credentials still cover the archive. If I access them tonight, he'll see that too." She stopped. Shikyam. The problem was geometric. Every move she made inside her own systems left a trace. And if someone was watching those traces, every move told them exactly what she'd found. She needed the data, but accessing the data signaled what she knew, and signaling what she knew changed what they'd do with the evidence. "I need to access those files in a way that looks like routine administrative work," she said. "Is there such a thing? You going into the pre-certification archive on a Saturday night?" "No," she thought. "But I could generate a system audit request, a full archive integrity check scheduled overnight. It would pull everything, and it would look like a standard IT operation." She paused. "I'd need to run it from the system administrator account, not mine." "Do you have admin credentials?" "I have access to the admin infrastructure as CEO. I can initiate a system process without it flagging as a personal access event." She was already pulling up the system administration panel. "It'll take 4 hours to run, but in the morning, I'll have a copy of every file in that archive, and it'll look like a routine backup." "You've done this before." I built the access architecture. I know what looks normal. She started entering the parameters. And I need you to go home. He looked at her. Why? Because if someone is watching access logs, they'll see your visitor credential was here. That's already done. But if they look at the building security footage and see you leave at a normal hour, it's a different picture than if you're here at midnight. She kept entering the parameters without looking at him. I'm a CEO working late in her own building on a weekend. That's normal. You being here for 6 hours is a question mark. He was quiet for a moment. I don't love leaving you here alone. I'm in a secure building with a keycard system and a security desk. That's not what I meant. She looked at him then. He wasn't performing concern. He just had it, uncomplicated and direct, the way he had most things. I'm fine, she said. Go home to your daughter. He picked up his jacket. At the door to the engineering bay, he stopped. I'm going to go through the regulatory filing again tonight. The discrepancies Marcus found. I want to map them against the original certification specs. I have those from the public record. You'll be up until 2 in the morning. Lily gets up at 6 regardless. I've accepted this about my life. He said it dry enough that it was almost funny. Send me whatever the archive audit pulls as soon as you have it. I will. He left. She listened to his footsteps down the hall, the elevator, and then the building was quiet. She finished setting up the archive audit and let it run. She pulled her chair back and looked at the city through the glass walls, the Saturday night version of it, louder now, more lit. Somewhere out there, 40 people had gotten a cancellation email, and not one of them had picked up a phone. She thought about that differently now. In the first hours when she'd been sitting alone among the empty chairs, it had felt like a judgment, like evidence of something she hadn't let herself fully examine about the relationship she'd built around work, about what she'd mistaken for loyalty, about what she'd never asked for because she'd been too busy building things to notice she needed it. That was still true, partially. But now it was also a data point in a different story, one where someone had made a calculated decision to isolate her, to ensure that the one night she'd planned as a statement of return was instead a night that would shake her confidence, make her feel forgotten, make her feel small in a room she'd rented to feel large. It had almost worked. She pulled up her text thread with Dana Feller, the unread message, still sitting there. She typed, I know about the cancellation emails. I know you received one. I'm not angry, but I need to know. When you got it, did anything seem off about it? She sent it and put the phone face down on the desk. The archive audit was running. She pulled Dylan Marsh's access logs back up and started reading from the beginning, not just the late night sessions, but all of it. 14 months of an engineer's working life, the digital trace of someone who had come in every day and done his job, and then one night at 2 a.m. had found something in a file he probably hadn't expected to find, and then 6 weeks later had stopped coming in at all. She wondered where Dylan Marsh was now, whether he'd found the better offer, or whether the better offer had found him in the specific way that made it impossible to refuse. Her phone buzzed at 10:17 p.m. Not Dana, not Marcus. A number she didn't recognize, no contact saved. She opened the message. You should stop looking. What you're doing can hurt people who don't deserve to be hurt. She read it twice. Then she took a screenshot, forwarded it to Marcus, and put the phone down. She looked at the archive audit, 31% complete. 3 more hours. She turned back to Dylan Marsh's access logs and kept reading. The threat, if that's what it was vague enough to be deniable. People who don't deserve to be hurt could mean anything. It could be a warning about legal liability, about collateral damage, about Sienna's own position if she pursued this and didn't find what she thought she'd find. It was designed to be interpreted multiple ways. That was intentional, the kind of thing written by someone careful, someone who understood that a threatening message that could be read as concern was harder to act on than an explicit threat. But it had come to her personal number, not her work line. Her personal number, which was not public, which was known to people she'd given it to directly. She thought about the 40 guests at the dinner. She thought about who among them might have a reason to warn her off. She thought about Brandon. She thought about the careful, measured way he'd spoken to her in the weeks since she'd come back. Not cold, not hostile, just slightly adjusted, like a thermostat turned 2 degrees in a direction that was hard to name. She'd told herself it was the residue of their professional renegotiation, The slight friction of someone who'd run things for 11 months handing them back to their rightful owner. She'd told herself that because the alternative required her to look at something she'd been avoiding. The archive audit hit 50%. She got up, found the kitchen at the end of the hall, and made herself a coffee from the machine that was always stocked because she'd insisted on it, and carried it back to the workstation. The thing about Brandon was that she had known him his whole life. She'd known him at 7 years old, at 14, at 22 when he'd shown up in her office with a business school resume and an earnest pitch about wanting to help build something. She had hired him because he was capable and because she trusted him, and those two things had always felt connected. The trust feeding into the assessment of capability, the capability reinforcing the trust. She hadn't distinguished between them because she hadn't needed to. She was distinguishing between them now. The capability was real. She'd watched it operate for 8 years. She knew what he could do when he applied himself, when he cared about the outcome. That was, she understood now, exactly the problem. At 1:23 a.m., the archive audit completed. She downloaded the output to her personal directory, encrypted it, and sent a copy to Marcus's secure transfer system. Then she opened the folder and started at the beginning. The pre-certification testing files for the Apex were organized chronologically, oldest to newest, a year and a half of iterative safety testing represented in data packages and summary reports and communications between the testing team and the regulatory affairs group. She started with the packages from 8 months before the accident. The testing parameters, the results, the sign-offs, everything clean, everything correct. She moved forward in time. 6 months before the accident, still clean. 4 months before the accident, she stopped. There was a summary report for a component stress test that had been run on the primary balance sensors, the same sensor cluster where the compensatory routine had been inserted. The report was dated 4 months before her accident. The lead signature on the report was Dylan Marsh. The test results showed an anomalous failure rate at the upper end of the stress parameters. Not high enough to trigger automatic disqualification, but high enough that the protocol required a secondary review and a documented risk assessment before proceeding to the next testing phase. She scrolled to the next document. The secondary review was there, dated 3 weeks after the stress test. The reviewer was Brandon Whitmore. The assessment: anomaly within acceptable tolerance margins. Proceed to phase 3 testing. She sat with that for a long time. The coffee went cold. The city outside the glass walls hummed on in the dark. Brandon had signed off on it. He'd looked at a failure rate in the primary balance sensors and written the words acceptable tolerance margins and cleared the product to keep moving through certification. And 4 months later, Sienna had been in her wheelchair, the production version of the device she'd been testing, the device that shared its sensor architecture with the Apex, when something had gone wrong. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. He answered on the second ring. "I got your message," he said. "The unknown number." "I found something else," she said. Her voice was steady. She'd always been good at steady. "Can you write this down?" She told him about the stress test report, about the failure rate, about the secondary review. She read him the exact language, anomaly within acceptable tolerance margins, and she gave him the document reference numbers so he could pull them himself. When she finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That's not a clerical error," he said. "No." "Sienna." His voice was careful in a specific way. "If Brandon signed off on a known defect and your accident occurred because of that component, we're not talking about corporate fraud anymore." "I know what we're talking about," she said. She'd known since the parking structure, really, since the quiet, certain feeling that had settled in her chest while she sat in the car and thought about underneath. She'd known, and she'd needed the data to confirm it, and now she had the data, and knowing something confirmed was a different weight than knowing something suspected. "I need Dylan Marsh," she said. "I need him to tell me what he saw in those files. I need him to confirm what the stress test actually showed before the summary report was written." "I have a contact reaching out tomorrow," Marcus said. "I'll push it to morning." "Tell your contact it's urgent." She paused. "Tell them someone already sent me a warning to stop looking." Marcus said something under his breath that she couldn't quite hear. "Screenshot and forward everything." "Already done." She hung up and sat in the engineering bay for a while longer. The audit output sat in her directory, encrypted and backed up in 2 separate locations. The handwritten list was on the desk in front of her. 11 items, and now she had a 12th, written in Brandon Whitmore's signature under the words acceptable tolerance margins. She thought about calling Ethan. It was 1:45 in the morning, and he'd gone home to his daughter, and he'd said he'd be up until 2 anyway. She picked up her phone and put it down again. Then she picked it up and typed, "Are you still up?" 3 dots. Then, "Yeah. What did you find?" She sent him the document reference numbers and a 2-line summary. She watched the dots appear and disappear twice before his response came through. Brandon signed off on it. "Yes." A long pause. "How are you doing?" It was such a plain question, not what's the next move or what does this mean legally or any of the other things that were legitimate and correct to ask. Just that. She looked at the empty engineering bay. At the Apex prototype in its charging dock across the room, sitting there the way it always sat, solid, considered, the product of years of work and real engineering, and the genuine belief that people who moved through the world differently deserved better tools. She'd built that. It was real, and it was good, and someone who knew exactly what it meant to her had spent the past year trying to hollow it out from the inside. "I'm okay," she typed. "Go to sleep. In a bit. Let me know if you find anything else." She put the phone in her pocket and looked at the prototype for another long minute. Then she packed up her notes, shut down the workstations, and left the building. Outside, the city was still going. It always was. She sat in her car and thought about a 7-year-old Brandon at a family dinner, laughing at something she'd said. She thought about his face 2 years ago when she'd told him she was hiring an external COO. The careful way he'd said that makes sense, I understand. The smile that had taken a half-second longer than it should have. She started the car and drove home. In the morning, Marcus's contact would reach out to Dylan Marsh. In the morning, Ethan would have his analysis of the regulatory discrepancies. In the morning, the shape of what Brandon had done would be a little clearer and a little more provable, and she'd be one step closer to having what she needed. But tonight, driving home through the quiet streets, she let herself feel the specific weight of it. The betrayal that didn't have a clean edge because it came from someone she'd known her whole life, someone she'd handed the keys to when she was lying in a hospital bed, someone who had sat across from her at family dinners and quarterly reviews and late-night strategy sessions, and had been building something behind her back the whole time. She felt it, and she kept driving. She'd deal with it in the morning. Dylan Marsh lived in a rented house 40 minutes outside the city, in a neighborhood that had the particular quality of somewhere people moved to when they needed to be less findable. Not remote, not rural, just far enough from the center of things that you'd have to make a deliberate decision to show up at someone's door. Marcus's contact reached him Sunday morning. By Sunday afternoon, Marcus had called Sienna with a single sentence. "He'll talk, but only in person, and not at the office." Ethan drove. Sienna had offered to arrange a car, but he'd said he had a car and it was easier, and she hadn't argued because she was spending her energy on things that mattered more than the logistics of transportation. Lily was with the neighbor again, the one with the better streaming setup, and Ethan had told her he'd be back by dinner without specifying where he was going, which Sienna gathered was a version of honesty calibrated for 6-year-olds. They didn't talk much on the drive out. The city thinned and then gave way to the kind of landscape that existed between things. Not quite suburbs, not quite countryside, strip malls and industrial parks, and then suddenly stretches of trees. Ethan drove the way he did most things, without performance, hands at a natural position on the wheel. Marcus said he sounded scared, Sienna said, somewhere around the 20-minute mark. Marcus's contact said that. Or Marcus. Marcus's contact. Marcus said he sounded careful. She looked at the trees going past. There's a difference. Scared and careful usually mean the same source, Ethan said. Dylan Marsh answered the door before they knocked. He'd been watching for the car. He was 34 with the kind of thinness that came from not eating regularly rather than from effort, and eyes that did a quick assessment of both of them before he stepped back to let them in. The house was almost aggressively ordinary inside. Rental furniture, minimal personal items, a laptop on the kitchen table that he closed when they came in. There was a half-eaten bowl of cereal on the counter from what might have been this morning or possibly yesterday. "You're Whitmore," he said to Sienna. Not unfriendly, just establishing. "Yes." He looked at Ethan. Ethan Calloway. I'm working with her. Doing what? Looking at things, Ethan said. Dylan seemed to find this answer acceptable, or at least not unacceptable. He pulled a chair out from the kitchen table and sat down heavily, and Sienna and Ethan took the remaining chairs without waiting to be invited. I signed an NDA when I left, Dylan said. I know, Sienna said. I'm not asking you to violate it. Then what are you asking? I'm asking you to tell me what you found in the pre-certification archive 4 months before my accident. She kept her voice level and direct because she'd found over the years that people who were scared responded better to level and direct than to careful and diplomatic. Careful and diplomatic felt like a setup. The stress test results on the primary balance sensor cluster, what the raw data actually showed. Dylan looked at the closed laptop. He was quiet for a long moment. How did you know I accessed those files? Access logs, she said. Your pattern changed 6 weeks before your resignation. You were in the archive at 2 a.m. pulling pre-certification data. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, more like the expression of someone who had been braced for a long time and was tired of it. They told me the logs had been cleared. Sienna didn't react to that. They weren't. He was quiet again. Then he put both hands flat on the table like he was steadying himself. The stress test showed a failure rate of 8.3% at upper range load parameters. That's above the threshold for mandatory secondary review and risk assessment. I know, I read the summary report. Then you know Brandon Whitmore signed the secondary review. I know he signed it. I read his assessment. His assessment was wrong, Dylan said. Not by accident. He paused. The raw data I pulled that night, I was looking for the full sensor calibration history. There was a discrepancy in a measurement I'd been trying to trace for 3 weeks. When I found it, I also found that the pre-certification stress test data had been altered. The original test results showed a failure rate of 11.7%, not 8.3. The number sat in the kitchen between all 3 of them. 11.7, Ethan said, at upper range load parameters. That's not a margin issue. That's a disqualifying failure rate. At 11.7, the component doesn't pass. Full stop. It gets redesigned or replaced before anything moves forward. Dylan's voice was flat, the flatness of someone reciting something they've gone over many times. The number in the summary report, 8.3, that number was changed. The raw data I accessed that night still had the original file metadata. The timestamp on the test results didn't match the timestamp on the summary document. Someone had edited the summary and put a different number in. And you put the original number in the secondary review, Sienna said quietly. Before the summary was changed. I never wrote a secondary review. My name isn't on any secondary review. He said it with a precision that suggested he'd practiced saying it. I found out about Brandon's sign-off when I went looking for who had approved the Phase 3 progression. I hadn't been consulted. I was the lead architect on the sensor integration, and nobody had asked me. What did you do? He looked at his hands. I put together everything I had, the original metadata, the timestamp discrepancy, the altered number. I was going to bring it to you directly. A pause. I was 12 days from requesting a meeting with your office when Brandon called me in. Ethan leaned forward slightly. What happened in that meeting? He told me that I'd misread the metadata, that the timestamp discrepancy was a system artifact from a server migration, that 8.3 was the correct number and my version of the file was a corrupted draft. He stopped. He said it all very calmly, like he was explaining something obvious to someone who was confused. Another pause. And then he said that I'd been a strong contributor to the team, and that given the stress I'd clearly been under, he'd been in contact with a company in Denver that was looking for a senior architect at a significant salary increase, and that he'd be happy to put in a personal recommendation. The kitchen was quiet. He walked you out of the building, Sienna said. 6 weeks later. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. The particular sophistication of it, not a threat, not a confrontation, just a calm redirection, an explanation that made Dylan sound confused, an offer that made leaving sound like winning. By the time it was done, there was nothing for Dylan to stand on. His original files were in an archive he no longer had access to, and Brandon Whitmore was standing between him and anyone he could tell. "Did you keep anything?" Ethan asked. Dylan was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he pushed back from the table and went to the kitchen counter. He opened the cabinet under the sink. Not the most sophisticated hiding place, Sienna noted, but probably fine for an NDA rather than anything more serious, and pulled out a manila envelope that had the particular look of something that had been handled many times. He put it on the table. "I made copies the night I found the metadata discrepancy, before the meeting with Brandon, before I knew what was coming." He looked at Sienna. "I didn't know what to do with them. I've been waiting to figure that out for 5 months." Sienna opened the envelope. Inside, printed copies of the original stress test data, the metadata comparison, and a 2-page document in Dylan's handwriting that walked through the discrepancy step by step. Clean, methodical, the work of an engineer who documented his own findings the way he'd document a bug report. She looked at it for a long time. "Dylan, I need to ask you something directly." "Okay." "When you came to me, when you were 12 days from requesting that meeting, what were you going to tell me about the accident?" He met her eyes. "That the component that failed in your wheelchair shared its sensor architecture with the Apex prototype. That the failure mode matched the upper range load parameters from the stress test. That if the original number, 11.7, had been reported correctly, the design would have gone back to engineering and the component would have been replaced before any production unit was built." He stopped. "I was going to tell you that I thought someone knew, that someone had seen the failure rate and decided the schedule mattered more than fixing it." Sienna held the envelope. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that fit inside the normal scale of conversation. Ethan spoke. "Would you be willing to give a formal statement to Sienna's legal team?" "If I give a statement, the NDA, your NDA doesn't cover evidence of criminal conduct," Sienna said. "Marcus Webb will tell you the same thing. NDAs have limits." Dylan looked at the envelope in her hands. He looked like someone who had been waiting for someone to say that exact sentence for 5 months. "If I do this, I need to know you're not going to stop halfway. If this goes public and then gets buried, I lose everything. The recommendation Brandon gave me, that job in Denver, I still have it. I can't afford to lose it." "I'm not going to stop halfway," Sienna said. "You said that like it's completely in your control." "It's not," she said honestly, "but I'm telling you what I intend." He looked at her for a long moment, with the specific look of someone evaluating whether to believe a thing they want to believe. Then he nodded once, short and firm. They left Dylan's house at 4 p.m. with the manila envelope and Dylan's verbal commitment to speak with Marcus Webb before the end of the week. On the drive back, Ethan was quiet until the city started reappearing on the horizon, and then he said, 11.7%. "Yeah." He knew, before your accident. Brandon knew the component had a failure rate that should have pulled it from production. He signed off on it anyway. He altered the data and signed off on it anyway. She was looking out the window at the city growing closer. He wanted the product on schedule. The Apex was the centerpiece of the Series D pitch. Delay the Apex, you delay the funding round. Delay the funding round. And suddenly the company's valuation looks different. And the COO, who's been handling operations while the CEO is in the hospital, looks less effective. She paused. If the product launches on schedule, the company looks strong. If it launches on schedule and the CEO is still in recovery, the COO looks like the one who kept things together. Ethan glanced at her. He was building a case for taking over. He was building the appearance of being indispensable. She said it without particular heat. The heat had a way of rising in her chest and then settling somewhere lower, becoming something more useful. He needed me to be gone long enough. The accident helped with that. And he knew about the component. He signed off on a failure rate that should have stopped production. Whether he specifically knew what would happen, she stopped. I don't know. Maybe he told himself it was within acceptable range. Maybe he convinced himself. She looked at the city. That doesn't actually change what he did. Ethan didn't say anything to that. They drove the rest of the way in a silence that had weight but wasn't uncomfortable. When he pulled up outside her building, she sat for a moment before getting out. The board meeting is Thursday, she said. Quarterly review. How much time do we have to pull everything together? 3 days. She picked up her bag. Marcus needs Dylan's formal statement, the document copies, the original metadata files, and the regulatory discrepancy analysis you've been building. If we have all of that, we have enough to put in front of a legal team and demand an independent investigation. She paused. The problem is, Brandon knows I've been in the building. He may already know I pulled the archive data, and if he moves first, he presents his version to the board before you can present yours, Ethan said. He's been preparing his version for a year. She looked at him. I've had 4 days. He held her look. Then we need to be better in 4 days than he's been in a year. She got out of the car. Then she leaned back in through the window because something had been sitting with her since Dylan's kitchen and she needed to say it. Ethan, you should know, while this is more than what you signed up for. When you walked into that dining room and asked if you could sit down, you weren't agreeing to be part of a corporate fraud investigation. I know. You have a daughter. You have a job. You have a life that doesn't involve any of this. I know that too. He said it without defensiveness, just as plain fact. I'm still here. She looked at him for a second. Okay. She went inside. Monday arrived fast and difficult. Marcus confirmed a meeting with Dylan by Wednesday. Ethan sent her his regulatory analysis at 7 a.m., 21 pages, methodical, cross-referenced against the original certification specs and the altered filing. The discrepancies were unambiguous when laid out side by side. 16 separate data points that had been changed, and the changes all ran in the same direction, making the component look safer than the raw data showed. She spent Monday in meetings she'd had scheduled for 2 weeks. Her legal team, her head of communications, a product review session that she sat through while keeping her face neutral and her participation exactly normal, because the meeting included 3 of Brandon's direct reports, and she couldn't afford to signal anything. Not yet. Brandon came by her office at 3 p.m. He knocked on the open door, which he always did, the gesture of someone who respected boundaries, who understood the codes of professional consideration. He was 41, with the kind of steady handsomeness that photographed well at conferences, dark hair going slightly gray at the temples in a way that had started looking authoritative rather than aging. He was wearing a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, no tie, the conference-ready version of casual. He looked completely normal. "Got a minute?" he said. She looked up from her screen, kept her face exactly where she needed it to be. "Sure." He came in and sat in one of the chairs across from her desk, the same chairs she'd had people sit in for 8 years of meetings, and he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees in the easy way he always did, comfortable, familiar, like 2 people who'd known each other their whole lives. "I wanted to flag something before Thursday," he said. "I've been hearing some concern from a few board members about the Apex timeline. The regulatory filing delay has people anxious. I'm handling the filing. I know you are. I just wanted to make sure you had the context." He paused. "There's also been some conversation, and I want you to hear this from me, not from someone else, about the scope of the role since you've been back. A few board members have expressed concern about whether you're stretched too thin. They're coming from a supportive place, Sienna. Nobody's looking to undermine anything." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of a concerned colleague, a family member, someone who had her best interests in mind. The expression was good. She had to give him that. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. "I always want you to have the full picture." He sat back. "Is everything okay? You seem—" He tilted his head slightly. "I don't know. You came in over the weekend, which isn't unusual, but Kelly mentioned you were here late Saturday." There it was. She'd expected it somewhere in the conversation, the access logs, the way she'd known they would show up. "I was reviewing the archive data," she said. "Routine audit. I like to run them personally every few months. It's in my operating notes if you want to check." "Of course." He smiled. It was a good smile. "I wasn't questioning anything, just making sure you're taking care of yourself." "I'm fine," she said. "Thanks for the heads up about Thursday. I'll be ready." He stood, buttoned his jacket. At the door he paused. The pause had the quality of something practiced. "Sienna, You know I want what's best for you and for the company. That's always been true." "I know," she said. After he left, she sat very still for a moment. Then she opened her laptop and sent Marcus a message. "He knows. Move everything up." The Tuesday call with Dylan and Marcus lasted 2 hours. Dylan walked through his findings methodically, with Marcus asking clarifying questions, and the two of them building a formal record of what Dylan had found, when he'd found it, and what had happened when he'd tried to report it. Marcus recorded the call with Dylan's consent. Ethan sat in on the call at Sienna's request, listening in from his home, and at one point asked Dylan a technical question about the metadata timestamp format that sharpened the documentation in a way that took Dylan a moment to recognize was helpful rather than challenging. After the call, Marcus called Sienna separately. "What we have is strong," he said. "It's not complete. In a court proceeding, Brandon's legal team would argue the altered data was a corrected version, not a fraudulent one. They'd attack the metadata analysis. They'd call Dylan's credibility into question and point to the NDA and the resignation timing." He paused. "But for a board presentation, for the purpose of forcing an independent investigation, it's enough." "Barely." "Barely," she repeated. "It's enough to create reasonable doubt about the integrity of the certification process. It's enough to demand a freeze on the regulatory filing and an external audit. If the board acts on it, the external audit will find the rest." "If the board acts on it?" "Yes, if." She knew what if meant. The board that Thursday would be the same board that had deferred to Brandon during her absence, the same board that had listened to his version of events for 11 months, the same board that was apparently having conversations about whether she was stretched too thin. She was walking into a room full of people who had been worked on for a year by someone who was very good at working on people, and she had 4 days of documentation, a scared former employee's statement, and the analysis of a man who wasn't even officially affiliated with the company. It wasn't enough to win the room, she knew that, but she had to go anyway. Wednesday evening, Ethan came to the office. He brought Lily because the neighbor was unavailable, and Lily had, apparently without much negotiation, decided that coming to the office sounded interesting. Lily sat at an empty workstation in the corner of the conference room with Ethan's tablet and headphones and a bag of pretzels, deeply invested in something animated, while Sienna and Ethan went through the presentation materials for the 3rd time. "The opening sequence," Ethan said, "lead with the regulatory discrepancy, not with the accident." "Why?" "Because if you lead with the accident, the first thing they process is she's bringing her personal injury into a business meeting. If you lead with the regulatory discrepancy, it's a compliance issue before it's a personal one. Same facts, different order." She looked at him. "That's right. I do read occasionally." She almost smiled. "The stress test data is the anchor. Everything before it leads to it. Everything after it follows from it. If I lose the room on anything, I need to be able to come back to Dylan's documentation and the metadata analysis." "You won't lose the room," Ethan said. "You might not win it, but you won't lose it. You know those aren't the same thing." "I know." He held her look. "You won't lose it." From the corner, Lily said, without looking up from the tablet, "She's going to be great." Both of them looked at her. "I have headphones," Lily said, "not earplugs." She pulled one side of the headphones off and looked at Sienna with complete seriousness. "Are you nervous?" Sienna considered lying. "A little." Lily nodded as though this was the correct answer. "My dad was nervous the first time he cooked dinner for people who weren't me. He burned the pasta." She looked at Ethan. "You burned the pasta." "I know I burned the pasta," Ethan said. "But then he learned how to not burn it," Lily said to Sienna, with the tone of someone delivering wisdom. "So." She put the headphone back on and returned to her show. Ethan looked at the ceiling for a second. "She's not wrong," Sienna said. "She's rarely wrong, which I find exhausting." But he said it the way he said most things about Lily, with the kind of exasperation that was just love wearing a practical coat. They worked until 9. When they finally packed up, Ethan walked her to the elevator while Lily, half asleep again in the specific way that small children fell asleep, was carried against his shoulder. "After tomorrow," he said, "regardless of how it goes, you know the documentation doesn't disappear. If the board doesn't act, Marcus takes it further. I know. So tomorrow isn't the last move. I know that too. She pressed the elevator button. It's still important. Yeah, he said. It is. The elevator opened. She looked at the two of them, Ethan and Lily, the small sleeping weight of her against his shoulder, the uneven pigtails she still insisted on doing herself, the bag of pretzels tucked under Ethan's arm alongside the files. Something about the image stayed with her in a way that was hard to name. Thank you, she said, for all of this. He didn't say of course or no problem or any of the filler phrases people use to deflect sincerity. He just said, good luck tomorrow. And then, you don't need it, but good luck anyway. She rode the elevator down alone. The board meeting was at 10 o'clock Thursday morning. She was in the building by 7:30. She went through the materials one final time, made 2 small adjustments to the ordering that Ethan had been right about, and then she sat in her office and looked at the city for half an hour, because she'd learned over the years that the 30 minutes before a significant meeting were better spent being still than being busy. At 9:15, she got a text from a number she didn't recognize, different number than the one before. Different enough that it could have been coincidence, except that she was past believing in coincidence. Last chance to handle this internally. The board doesn't need to know about Dylan Marsh. She forwarded it to Marcus, put the phone in her bag, and went to the boardroom. Brandon was already there when she arrived. He was standing at the credenza along the far wall, getting coffee, talking to 2 board members in the relaxed way of someone who had been in this room many times. He looked up when she came in, and his expression did the thing it always did. Warm, familiar. A slight upward shift at the corners that said cousin, colleague, family. He nodded at her. She nodded back. She took her seat at the head of the table. She set her materials in front of her. She looked at the room filling with the 7 people who would decide the next hour. And she thought about Dylan Marsh's kitchen, about the manila envelope under the sink, about an engineer who had found the truth at 2 a.m. and hadn't known what to do with it for 5 months. She thought about 40 empty chairs and a stranger in the doorway, and a question asked without calculation. At 10 o'clock, the meeting was called to order. She opened her presentation on the screen behind her. The first slide showed the regulatory filing documentation. The discrepancies Marcus had flagged, the specific data points side by side with the original certification specs. Before we get to the quarterly agenda, she said, I need to bring something to the board's attention. She heard Brandon set his coffee cup down. She didn't look at him. I've identified evidence of material alterations to the Apex safety certification data. I have documentation of the changes, expert analysis of the discrepancies, and a formal statement from the former lead architect on the sensor integration project. She advanced to the next slide. I'm requesting an immediate freeze on the regulatory filing and an independent external audit of the Apex certification process. The room was quiet. She looked at the board, one face at a time. Some of them were already frowning, but not in the way she'd feared. Not in the here she goes way, but in the what are we looking at way. That was something. Then Brandon spoke. I think, he said from his seat to her left in the careful, measured voice he'd been using for a year, that before we proceed, we should have a broader conversation about the context here. She looked at him. He met her eyes. The warm familiarity was gone. By all means, she said, let's have that conversation. The next 2 hours would either be the beginning of the end of his plan or the end of everything she'd spent 8 years building. She didn't know which yet. She sat at the head of the table with her materials in front of her and her back straight, and she began. Brandon didn't raise his voice. That was the thing she kept coming back to afterward. He never raised his voice, not once in those 2 hours, and that was what made it effective. He waited until she had finished her opening presentation. He waited with the patience of someone who had prepared for this specific moment, who had walked through it in his head enough times that the actual event felt like a rehearsal running on schedule. When she finished, he set his hands flat on the table and looked at the board with an expression that managed to be simultaneously concerned and reluctant, like a man who hated what he was about to do. I want to say first, he said, that everything Sienna has brought here today comes from a place of genuine commitment to this company. That's never been in question. She heard the structure of it immediately. The framing device, the but that hadn't been said yet but was already present in the shape of the sentence. What I think the board needs to understand, he continued, is the timeline of the past 11 months. Sienna went through something that would have broken most people. The accident, the recovery, the return. I've watched her do all of that, and I have nothing but respect for how she's managed it. He paused. But I've also watched the strain, and I want to be honest with you all, because that's what this board deserves. One of the board members, Richard Hale, 63, who had been on the board since year 3, and who Sienna had always found impossible to fully read, leaned forward slightly. Brandon continued, "The documentation Sienna has presented comes primarily from a source who signed a non-disclosure agreement as part of a voluntary resignation, who was compensated for that resignation, and who has since had no access to the company's systems." He looked at the slide she'd put up behind her. The metadata analysis she's referencing is the work of a private individual with no formal relationship to Vantage Motion and no engineering credentials in mobility systems specifically. His credentials are in product safety and systems architecture, Sienna said, which are valuable in many contexts. Brandon's tone didn't change, but not the same as deep domain expertise in our specific certification framework. He moved on before she could respond. The regulatory discrepancies Marcus Webb flagged. I've spoken with our internal compliance team. Their assessment is that the filing reflects a corrected version of the test data, updated after the initial summary was generated. That's a normal part of an iterative certification process. The correction changed a disqualifying failure rate into a passing one, Sienna said. The correction reflected a recalibration of the test parameters that happened to affect the reported results. He said it smoothly. There's documentation for that recalibration. I can have it in front of the board within the hour. She looked at him. He had documentation. Of course he had documentation. He'd had a year. Richard Hale spoke. Brandon, what exactly are you asking the board to conclude from all this? Brandon paused. It was the pause of someone who had decided to say a difficult thing and was giving himself one last moment before saying it. I'm asking the board to consider whether Sienna is currently in the best position to be making decisions of this scope, and I say that with deep personal respect for her. He looked at her directly. The accusation she's presenting today, against me, specifically, began 3 weeks after a very difficult public experience on her birthday. She's been pulling company data at 1 a.m. on weekends. She's brought in an outside person who has no formal role here. She's compiled a case against her own family member based on metadata timestamps and the testimony of a former employee she's never actually spoken to before last weekend. He stopped. I'm not questioning her integrity. I'm questioning her judgment right now, and I think the board has a responsibility to do the same. The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms got quiet when something uncomfortable had been said that a significant portion of the audience had already been thinking. Sienna felt it. The shift in the air, the small recalibrations happening in real time as 7 people adjusted their internal assessments based on what they'd just heard. She'd sat in enough boardrooms to know what that felt like. She'd been on the right side of it and on the wrong side of it, and she knew which side she was on right now. She looked at the board. She looked at Richard Hale, who was frowning at the table. She looked at Patricia Osei, who was the board's independent director, and who had been watching both of them with an expression Sienna couldn't read. She looked at the other 5 faces, each one running their own calculation. I'd like to respond to that, she said. Of course, Brandon said. She looked at the board and spoke carefully because she was angry in a specific way that sat right below her voice and she needed to not let it into the room. Not because anger was wrong, but because it would be used against her, added to the portrait Brandon had just painted with such careful strokes. The evidence I've presented doesn't depend on who found it or when I started looking, she said. It depends on whether the numbers are accurate. The original stress test showed an 11.7% failure rate. The summary report shows 8.3. Either those numbers match the raw data or they don't. That's verifiable. She advanced to the slide with Dylan's metadata documentation. The timestamp discrepancy on this file is not a system artifact. I can show you the server migration logs for the period in question. There was no migration. The timestamps are inconsistent because the file was edited after the fact. She looked at Brandon. If there's recalibration documentation, I'd like to see it. I'd like to see it now. Brandon's expression didn't change, but something around his eyes did. I said I could have it here within the hour. I'd need to call the compliance team. It should already be in the regulatory package. Everything supporting the certification data should be in the package you were preparing for the external filing. She kept her voice level. If the recalibration documentation exists, it's in that package. You can pull it from the filing records right now. Brandon looked at the board. I think the more constructive path here. Can you pull it or not? Sienna asked. A beat. I'd need to verify the exact location of the document. Richard Hale spoke. Brandon, if the documentation exists for the recalibration, it should be readily accessible. It is accessible, Richard. I'm saying I'd want to present it properly, rather than pulling it piecemeal in the middle of a meeting. He looked at Hale with the easy confidence of someone who had worked a room for a long time. What I think we should do is table this item, allow both sides to present their documentation in full to the board's legal advisors, and schedule a follow-up session in 2 weeks where we can have a complete picture. 2 weeks. She heard it for what it was. 2 weeks to make the recalibration documentation appear, 2 weeks to shore up whatever gaps she'd found, 2 weeks for the board to sit with the portrait of an emotionally compromised CEO who had been working at 1 a.m. and bringing strangers into the building. She looked at Patricia Osei, who had been quiet this entire time. Patricia was 57. She'd been an independent director for 3 years, brought in after the Series D specifically to represent shareholder interests rather than either management camp. She had a background in regulatory compliance and had worked for 2 years at a federal oversight agency before moving into private sector advisory. Sienna had always found her precise and careful and slightly hard to read, which she'd come to understand was intentional. Patricia, Sienna said, I'm requesting that the board vote on an immediate freeze of the Apex regulatory filing and an appointment of an independent auditor to review the certification data. Not in 2 weeks. Today. Patricia looked at her, then at Brandon, then at the documentation on the screen. If the freeze is warranted by the evidence, the 2-week delay creates liability for the board as well as management, she said. We'd have knowledge of a potential certification issue and have chosen to defer action. The evidence hasn't been established as credible, Brandon said. The board isn't obligated to act on allegations. The evidence is in the company's own archive, Sienna said. It doesn't require external verification to be credible, Wheaties. It requires someone to look at it. Brandon turned to the full board. He'd been building to this. She could feel it. Everything before had been set up. I want to make a formal recommendation, he said, that the board vote to place Sienna on a temporary leave of medical and operational review, 30 days, during which time the COO manages operations and an independent party, selected by the board, not by either of us, reviews both the certification documentation and the leadership continuity question. I make this recommendation with genuine concern for Sienna's well-being and for the company's stability. She'd known it was coming. She'd known it since Marcus had said he may move first, since the text from the unknown number that morning, since Brandon had walked into her office Monday afternoon and looked at her with his cousin's eyes and said, I always want you to have the full picture. She looked at the board. She looked at the vote that was about to happen, in a room where Brandon had spent 11 months and she had spent 4 days, and she understood the arithmetic of it before the first hand went up. Richard Hale voted yes. 2 others followed immediately. Patricia Osei did not raise her hand. She was looking at the metadata documentation on the screen, her reading glasses halfway down her nose. The vote was 4-3, 1 vote against her. The board chair, Owen Park, who had been largely silent, cleared his throat. The recommendation passes. Sienna, the board wants to emphasize that this is a temporary operational measure, not a judgment on your leadership. I understand what it is, she said. She did not raise her voice. She sat at the head of the table in the boardroom that had her name on the building plaque outside, and she absorbed the 4-3 vote, and she kept her face where she needed it to be. Brandon spoke briefly and quietly with 2 board members near the credenza. He did not look at her. He had the careful posture of someone who had gotten what they needed and was now focused on managing the aftermath correctly. She gathered her materials. Patricia Osei came to her side of the table. Sienna, she said quietly, I know. I voted against it. I know you did. Patricia looked at the documentation still on the screen. Get me the server migration logs, the ones you mentioned for the timestamp period, Get them to me today. Sienna looked at her. You believe it? I believe the metadata analysis is worth examining before any filing moves forward. Patricia's voice was careful and professional. I'm one vote, but if what you're showing me is accurate, the regulatory filing freeze should happen regardless of what the board voted today. I have standing to request it independently as a director. Can you do that? I need the server migration logs, and I need the original raw test data, not the summary document, the file itself. I can have both to you within 2 hours. Patricia nodded once, picked up her folder. I'll make some calls. She left the room. Sienna stayed seated for a moment after the others had largely filtered out. The quiet that followed a decisive meeting, the specific weight of having lost something significant. Brandon stopped at the door. He turned and looked at her, just the two of them now, and for a second the boardroom performance was gone, and it was just his face, the face she'd known for 30 years. I'm sorry it went this way, he said. He sounded like he meant it, which was the worst part. She couldn't decide whether that made him more frightening or just more sad. No, you're not, she said. He looked at her for a second, then he left. She sat in the empty boardroom and called Ethan. He picked up on the second ring. How bad? 4-3. Leave of review 30 days. Brandon is operational lead. She kept her voice matter of fact. Patricia Osei voted against it. She wants the server migration logs and the original raw test file. I need to get them to her in 2 hours. I can pull the server logs from the public infrastructure records. It'll take 30 minutes. A pause. Sienna, I'm sorry. Don't be sorry yet. She stood up. We're not done. No, we're not. She left the boardroom and went to her office, still her office for now, and sent the raw test file from her personal directory to Patricia Osei's encrypted email. Then she called Marcus. I heard, he said, which meant someone had already talked to him. Brandon will have the recalibration documentation fabricated within the week, she said. We need to move faster than that. I know. Marcus was quiet for a moment. The acquisition. What acquisition? Meridian Capital approached Vantage Motion last month about a strategic acquisition. It was in the board materials for Q2 review. I assumed you'd seen it. She hadn't seen it. She'd been back for 3 weeks, and there was still a layer of activity she hadn't fully regained access to. Things that had happened in the last month of her absence that were still trickling through the system. What are the terms? Meridian takes a 60% stake for $800 million. The deal closes in 45 days. A pause. If Brandon is operational lead when that deal closes, he controls the negotiation. And given the acquisition structure, the incoming stakeholder would effectively control the company. And Brandon would have a very comfortable arrangement with the incoming stakeholder. That would be a reasonable inference. She sat in her chair and looked at the city. He needs the deal to close before we can stop it. Which means we have less than 45 days to present a credible counter-narrative to the board. We have less than that, she said. If he moves the deal timeline up, he can, with board authorization, and he has the board. 4-3. 1 vote. She hung up and opened her laptop. The acquisition documents were in the board materials folder. She still had access, because the leave of review was operational, not administrative, which was a distinction she was going to hold on to with both hands. She read through the Meridian Capital terms in 15 minutes. The structure was clean and favorable looking on the surface and deeply problematic underneath, in ways that would take a financial analyst about an hour to map out clearly. She texted Ethan, "Can you look at an acquisition term sheet tonight?" 3 minutes later, "Send it." She sent it. Then she called Dylan Marsh. He answered on the second ring, and she told him what had happened at the board meeting in 2 sentences, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "What do you need from me?" "I need your formal statement filed with Marcus by tomorrow morning." "I thought it wasn't ready." "Marcus will make it ready." She paused. "Dylan, you said you needed to know I wasn't going to stop halfway." A silence. "Yeah. I'm still moving. I just need you to move with me." Another silence, longer. "Okay," he said. "Tomorrow morning." She spent the afternoon doing something she hadn't done in 3 weeks. She went through every board communication from the past 11 months. Not the official minutes, which she'd read, but the informal communications, the email threads, the discussion logs that lived in the board governance system. She'd had access all along. She'd been too focused on operations to sit and read everything. She read everything now. By 6 in the evening, she had a clear picture of how Brandon had built his position. Not in any single moment, but in accumulation. The right word in the right ear over 11 months. The way he'd framed her absence as a stability issue rather than a recovery. The way he'd positioned every initiative of his own as filling a gap she'd left rather than as an independent agenda. It was patient work, the kind of work that required both intelligence and a specific willingness to think 10 steps ahead of the person you were working against. She had to give him that too. Her phone buzzed at 6:45. Ethan. "The Meridian deal," he said. "The 60-40 structure is designed to dilute existing shareholders over 36 months. There are performance triggers in the term sheet that would accelerate Meridian's stake to 78% if Vantage Motion doesn't hit specific revenue targets in year 1, which Brandon would have significant control over, and which are set just high enough to be difficult." He paused. "There's also an indemnification clause that protects current management from liability in connection with any pre-acquisition regulatory matters." She stopped. "Say that again." "An indemnification clause. It's in Section 12. Vantage Motion and its current management are indemnified by Meridian against liability arising from regulatory or certification issues that predate the acquisition closing." She sat very still. "He built a legal exit," she said. "If the deal closes before the certification fraud is formally established, before there's a legal finding, the indemnification clause protects him." Ethan's voice was level. "He doesn't just need the deal to take over the company. He needs it to close so he's protected from everything we've found." The shape of it was fully visible now. Not just the corporate ambition, not just the power play. The whole architecture, built backward from a specific vulnerability, designed to lock the door before anyone could look through it. "How fast can he move the deal timeline, Shut?" she said. "With board authorization and Meridian's agreement? 30 days, maybe 25? We have less time than we thought." "Yes." She looked at the clock. The day had been long and difficult, and she was tired in a way that went past physical. The specific exhaustion of spending 6 hours watching someone reframe her own reality for an audience of 7 people, of losing 4 to 3, of having stood at the head of a table in a room with her name on the building and felt the ground shift underneath her. She thought about what Lily had said in the conference room Wednesday night, with total 6-year-old confidence. "She's going to be great." "Ethan," she said, "the board is presenting its quarterly review to a group of institutional investors next week. Meridian Capital is on the list. I saw that in the materials Tuesday afternoon. If we can get the complete documentation, Dylan's statement, the server logs, Patricia Osei's independent director report, your regulatory analysis, in front of that meeting, the Meridian deal is dead before it's officially alive." A pause. "That's 6 days." "I know." "Dylan's statement is in process. The server logs I have. Your regulatory filing documentation is solid." He was thinking out loud, the way engineers thought, tracking pieces. "Patricia Osei's report is the variable. If she requests the freeze independently, that becomes part of the public record before the investor meeting. She said she'd make calls. Have you heard back from her?" "Not yet." "Call her tonight," he said. "Don't wait for her to come to you." She was already picking up her phone. "I know." "And Sienna," he paused. "What?" "The board meeting today. What Brandon said about your judgment. I want you to know that's not what this looks like from outside the room. What you've done in the past 6 days, the documentation you've built, the way you've run this." He stopped, tried again. "He said you weren't thinking clearly. I've been watching you think clearly under a significant amount of pressure. I just wanted to say that." She didn't say anything for a second. "Thank you," she said. "Call me if you find anything else in the acquisition terms." She hung up and sat with the city outside her window for a moment. The early evening version of it, the light going amber, the streets filling with people coming out of their workdays. Ordinary Tuesday evening movement, normal human life. She called Patricia Osei. Patricia picked up on the fourth ring. "I've been expecting your call," she said, which meant she'd been thinking since the boardroom. "Did you get the server migration logs?" "I got them. Your colleague's analysis was thorough." A pause. "The timestamp discrepancy is real. There was no server migration in that period." Another pause. Shorter. "I've drafted an independent director's request for a regulatory filing freeze. I'm submitting it to the board chair tonight." Sienna exhaled. Not relief exactly, so there was still too much between here and anything that looked like resolution for it to be relief. But something. "I also want you to know," Patricia continued, "that what Brandon did in that boardroom today was technically within procedure, but not within the spirit of what this board is supposed to do." She said it in the careful language of someone who chose their words very precisely. "I'll be addressing that separately." "Thank you, Patricia." "Don't thank me. Get me the rest of it." She paused. "The acquisition timeline is being discussed at a level I'm not fully read into. If Brandon has already started conversations with Meridian about acceleration, we're working on it." "Work faster," Patricia said, and hung up. Sienna put her phone down and looked at her desk. The desk she'd sat at for 8 years, the view she'd earned, the building she'd named. Temporarily on leave. Operational control shifted. 4-3. She'd had worse numbers than 4-3. She'd walked into investor meetings with a prototype that weighed 12 pounds too much and a slide deck and come out with funding. She'd rebuilt a company after a near-fatal accident from a hospital bed, signing authorizations and answering emails between surgeries, because the company was hers, and she wasn't built for walking away from things she'd built. She opened a new document and started writing. 6 days. The investor meeting was in 6 days. She was going to need everything organized in a way that was impossible to dismiss. Not just accurate, but clear, sequenced, undeniable. The kind of presentation that didn't leave room for "let's table this" or "let's have a broader conversation." She wrote for 2 hours. At 9 o'clock, she sent the draft to Ethan and to Marcus with a single line: "Tell me what's missing." Ethan's response came back at 9:47. "Nothing's missing. Add the indemnification clause analysis at the end. Make it the last thing they see." Marcus's came at 10:15. "This is the strongest version of this case I've seen assembled this fast. I have 3 concerns about the legal framing on pages 8 and 11. Calling you in the morning." She read both messages, put the phone down, turned off her desk lamp. She sat in the dark office for a while. The city lit behind her, and she let herself feel the shape of the past 6 days. The birthday dinner she'd planned for 40 people and eaten with 2 strangers, the 1 a.m. parking garage, and the quiet certainty that had settled in her chest. The manila envelope in a kitchen cabinet 40 minutes outside the city, the boardroom this morning, and Brandon's careful voice and Patricia Osei not raising her hand. 6 days from the investor meeting, 1 independent director's freeze request working through the system. Dylan Marsh's statement filing in the morning. A 6-year-old who was rarely wrong. She had worked with worse numbers. She turned off the lights and went home. Patricia Osei's independent director filing hit the board governance system at 11:14 p.m. on Thursday night, less than 12 hours after the vote that had taken Sienna's operational control away by 1 margin. Sienna saw the notification at 6 a.m. Friday, before her first coffee. Still in the clothes she'd put on to come downstairs, standing in her kitchen reading her phone with the specific alertness of someone who had not slept as much as they'd needed to. The filing was 4 pages. It was precise, it was professionally worded, and it requested a mandatory freeze on all external filings related to the Apex certification pending independent audit, citing the director's independent review of company records and her determination that material discrepancies existed in the documentation. It was the kind of document that could not be quietly tabled or redirected into a 2-week review. It was the kind of document that created a legal record the moment it was filed. Sienna read it twice, standing in her kitchen in the early morning light, and felt the first thing in 6 days that she could honestly call momentum. She called Marcus at 6:15. He'd already seen it. "Patricia is serious," he said, and she could hear him moving through his own morning, the background sounds of a household that started early. "This filing means any external party, Meridian Capital included, has constructive knowledge of the certification dispute from this moment forward. If they close the acquisition while this is on the record, they assume the liability, which kills the indemnification clause, she said, which makes the deal significantly less attractive to Meridian, yes. A pause. Brandon is going to respond to this today. Be ready. She was already moving. The 6 days between the board meeting and the investor presentation were the most compressed work of Sienna's professional life, and that was saying something for a person who had built a company from a graduate thesis and a conviction. Each day had its own specific weight. Friday was documentation. She and Ethan and Marcus worked from 3 separate locations and sent drafts back and forth through encrypted channels, building the complete case package, Dylan's formal statement, the server log analysis, the metadata documentation, Ethan's regulatory discrepancy report, Patricia's director filing, and the acquisition term sheet analysis with the indemnification clause highlighted and explained in language a room full of institutional investors could read in under 2 minutes. Saturday, Brandon called her. She answered because not answering would have been a statement, and she wasn't ready to make that particular statement yet. I know about Patricia's filing, he said. I assumed you would. This is getting complicated in a way that hurts everyone. His voice had changed. Not the boardroom performance, not the careful, concerned cousin. Something underneath it, something more direct. The acquisition is good for the company. The valuation is strong. Meridian is a serious partner. Meridian is a serious partner with an indemnification clause that buries the certification fraud, she said. That's not a coincidence. A silence. I made decisions under significant time pressure. The product was on a critical path. The recalibration was legitimate. Brandon, she said his name quietly. I have the original metadata. I have the raw test file. I have Dylan Marsh's statement. I have the original failure rate and your signature under the secondary review. And I have the fact that you knew before my accident and signed off anyway. She paused. Don't try to convince me the recalibration was legitimate. Not on this call. Another silence. Longer. What do you want? He said. It was the first genuinely honest thing he'd said to her in probably longer than she'd realized. The question stripped of framing. I want to know if there's anything else, she said. Anything I haven't found. Because if there is, I'd rather know now than find it later in front of an investigative body. He was quiet for a long time. The accident report, he said finally. The firm that conducted the investigation. I made an introduction. The firm's principal and I have a long-standing relationship. She closed her eyes for a second. Just a second. That's in the presentation, she said. Now it is. She hung up and called Marcus immediately and told him what Brandon had said. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then, he just told you that. He told me that. That's either a genuine moment of something, or it's a calculated disclosure designed to make him look cooperative before everything comes out anyway. A pause. Either way, it's useful. Add it to the package, she said. The investigation firm, the relationship, all of it. Sienna. Marcus's voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Something careful in a different way, not professional, careful, but human careful. Are you okay? She thought about the question honestly. I don't know yet, she said. Ask me Tuesday. Sunday was the hardest day. Not because of work. The documentation was largely assembled. The presentation was taking shape. Marcus was running parallel legal processes she didn't need to manage directly. Sunday was hard because she had nothing to do. And when she had nothing to do, she thought. She thought about Brandon at 7 years old. She thought about the decision she'd made from a hospital bed to give him full access to the company, signing the authorization with hands that shook from the pain medication, trusting the most familiar face available because she'd been terrified, and she'd needed to trust something. She thought about what it meant that the most familiar face had been the wrong one to trust. She didn't feel sorry for herself about it. That wasn't quite the right word. It was more like she was looking at a completed picture for the first time, all the pieces in their final positions, and understanding that the picture had been this way for a long time, and she'd been seeing parts of it and not the whole. The careful tone in board meetings, the slight adjustments, the accident investigation that found nothing wrong, the birthday dinner that went empty. A year of someone systematically eroding her ground, quietly, professionally, while wearing the face of someone who loved her. The particular cruelty of that wasn't dramatic. It was just heavy. She sat with it Sunday afternoon in her apartment, in the chair by the window she'd always done her best thinking in, and she let it be heavy for a few hours because that was what it deserved. Not dramatized, not minimized, just acknowledged. Her phone buzzed at 3 p.m. Ethan. Taking Lily to the park, she says to tell you she believes in you. Direct quote. She looked at the message for a moment. Tell her thank you, she typed back. Enjoy the park. She put the phone down and looked at the city, and somewhere inside the heaviness she felt something else. Smaller, but more durable. Like the structural core of something that had been built to last. The company was hers. She'd built it from nothing. From a thesis that didn't work, and a prototype that gave people headaches. From investor meetings where she'd been told to come back in 5 years. From years of being the youngest and the most certain, and often the only person in the room who believed the thing she was saying was possible. She'd built it because the work mattered. Not abstractly, not as a business proposition, but because people who moved through the world differently deserved technology that was designed with actual human intelligence rather than as an afterthought. That was still true. That hadn't been touched. Monday she spent on the phone with institutional investors who would be in Tuesday's meeting. Not all of them, just the 4 she had direct relationships with. The ones who had been in at Series C or earlier, who knew her voice and her track record, and who she could call without it looking like a campaign. She didn't pitch them. She told them she had something they needed to see before the meeting and sent the documentation package. She let the work speak. 3 of the 4 called her back within 2 hours. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cool, the city wrapped in the kind of overcast that felt purposeful rather than accidental. Sienna was at the building by 8:15, which was early enough that the lobby was still quiet, the daytime population not yet fully arrived. She wore the navy blazer she'd bought 3 years ago for the Series D announcement, which had been the best day of her professional life up to that point, and which she'd always considered a useful coat. Ethan was waiting in the lobby. She hadn't asked him to come. He was just there, in the jacket that actually fit, with 2 coffees from the place down the street that she'd mentioned once 6 days ago in a conversation about something else entirely. You don't need to be here for this, she said. I know. He handed her the coffee. I want to see how it ends. It might not end well today. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. I've been looking at this for a week. I want to be in the building. She took the coffee. Lily. School. He checked his watch, which she was extremely reluctant about, for the record. She wanted to come. Tell her I'll report back. He nodded. She'll expect detail. They rode up in the elevator together. At the 7th floor, she said, There's a conference room adjacent to the investor presentation room. You can watch the proceedings from there. It's got a window into the main room. The door to the main room is going to be open because the format is open session. And if it goes wrong? If it goes wrong, I'll need you to not do anything dramatic. She looked at him. I mean that. No intervention, no sudden entrance. This has to be mine. Understood. A pause. And if it goes right? She almost smiled. Then it goes right. The investor presentation was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the main conference room, which was the largest room in the building, used for major announcements and quarterly reviews. It seated 80. By 10 o'clock, there were 63 people in the room. The board members, the institutional investor representatives, the Meridian Capital team, legal advisors from multiple parties, senior management, and Marcus Webb, who had positioned himself near the legal advisors section with the calm of someone who had been in rooms like this many times. Brandon was already seated when Sienna arrived. He saw her come in and his expression did something complicated that she didn't try to parse. He was with 2 of the board members who had voted with him Thursday, and with 2 people she didn't recognize who had the specific quality of acquisition-side legal counsel, expensive suits, deliberately neutral faces. She went to the front of the room. Owen Park, the board chair, opened the session with the standard language. Investor presentation, Q3 performance review, strategic outlook discussion including the Meridian acquisition proposal. He was halfway through his opening remarks when Sienna said, Owen, I need to address the board and the investors before the strategic discussion. Owen looked at her. The room looked at her. Brandon looked at her with an expression that had gone very still. Sienna is currently on operational leave, one of Brandon's board allies started. I'm on operational leave, she said, to the room. I'm not on leave for my position as a shareholder, as a board member, or as the founder of this company. I have the right to address this session. She looked at Owen Park. I have documentation that is directly material to the acquisition discussion. The investors in this room have a right to see it before any vote or commitment is made. Owen looked at his legal advisor. The legal advisor leaned in and said something in a low voice. Owen looked back at Sienna. 5 minutes, he said. She didn't need 5 minutes. She needed 3. She put the presentation on the screen, not the full package, which the 4 investors she'd called Monday had already seen, but the distilled version, 8 slides, each one carrying exactly the weight it needed to carry and nothing extra. The original stress test data and the altered summary. The metadata timestamp analysis. The failure rate, 11.7, not 8.3, in large, clear type. Dylan Marsh's statement, the key paragraph, the specific finding, the accident investigation firm and its principal's relationship with Brandon, the Meridian Acquisition's indemnification clause, section 12, and what it covered. She spoke for 3 minutes and 19 seconds. She knew because she'd timed it. When she finished, the room was quiet in a way that was different from the boardroom quiet last Thursday. That quiet had been the sound of people adjusting their positions. This quiet was the sound of people sitting very still because something had shifted in the room's center of gravity and they were waiting to feel where it settled. One of the Meridian Capital representatives, a woman in her 50s with the look of a senior partner, leaned over and said something to the person beside her. The person picked up a phone and left the room. One of the institutional investors Sienna had called Monday, a man named Gerald Pratt, who had been in at Series C and who had, she'd always thought, a good internal compass for when something was wrong, Bo raised his hand. I'd like to ask the board's legal advisors to comment on the director filing submitted by Patricia Osei. Patricia Osei, seated across the room, said clearly, the filing stands. The certification discrepancies are material and independently verified. Brandon spoke. He'd been quiet since Sienna began, which itself was information. The documentation Sienna is presenting has not been independently verified by the board. It's been verified by me, Patricia said. Not loudly, just clearly. And the metadata analysis was prepared by... I prepared the metadata analysis, Ethan said. Every head in the room turned toward the doorway. She had told him no dramatic entrance. He was standing in the doorway of the adjacent conference room, which was technically not the main room, which was technically not an entrance, which was technically within the letter of what she'd said, if not the spirit. She caught his eye. He gave her a look that was somewhere between I know and I couldn't help it. She decided to let it go. Ethan Calloway, he said to the room. I'm a product safety consultant. I have 15 years of experience in systems architecture and safety certification analysis. I prepared the metadata analysis and the documentation package. I'm available to walk through my methodology if anyone would like. Gerald Pratt said, I'd like that. What followed was not the clean cinematic collapse that stories sometimes gave their pivotal moments. It was 45 minutes of methodical, sometimes technical conversation. Ethan walking through the metadata analysis, Marcus presenting the legal implications of the altered data, the Meridian legal team asking pointed questions and receiving specific answers, 2 board members who had voted with Brandon last Thursday listening with increasingly uncomfortable expressions. Brandon's legal advisors conferred in low voices. Brandon himself sat at the table and was very quiet. The Meridian senior partner left the room twice on phone calls. When she came back the second time, she leaned over and spoke to Owen Park directly. Sienna couldn't hear what she said, but she watched Owen Park's face, and she understood the general shape of it. At 11:53, Owen Park called a 15-minute recess. During the recess, Marcus came to Sienna's side of the room and said, very quietly, Meridian is withdrawing the acquisition proposal. She exhaled. Their counsel told Owen they can't proceed with a deal that has this level of regulatory uncertainty on the record. They're not interested in the liability, regardless of the indemnification clause. He paused. The deal is dead. She looked across the room at Brandon, who was in a low-voiced conversation with his legal advisors. He looked like a man who understood what was happening and was trying to figure out which version of the next hour hurt least. "What happens now?" she said. "Now the board votes on whether to refer the certification matter to an independent external investigation. Given what's on the record today, Patricia's filing, the investor presentations, Meridian's withdrawal, that vote is going to look very different than Thursday's did." It did. The vote was 6-1. Brandon was the one. The external investigation was formally appointed before the session ended. Its mandate covered the certification data, the accident investigation, and the acquisition process. Its findings would be referred to the relevant regulatory and legal authorities. The board's legal advisors made very clear, in language that was professionally measured but unmistakable, that individual liability was a live question. Brandon's operational authority was suspended pending the investigation. He left the conference room without speaking to Sienna. She watched him go, the straight back, the composed face. The man she'd known for 30 years walking out of a room where everything he'd built over the past year had just come down. She felt something that wasn't triumph and wasn't sadness, exactly. It was something more complicated than either of those. The specific emotion that existed in the space where a long-held belief about a person had been replaced by a much harder truth, and the replacement had finally become real. She turned away from the door and found Ethan standing behind her. "The entrance," she said. "The doorway," he said. "I was in the doorway." "Ethan? You said no intervention. I didn't intervene. I answered a direct question." She looked at him for a second. "That's technically accurate." "I'm a precise person," he said. She almost laughed. It came out as something shorter, a breath, a release of something that had been held tightly for 6 days. "The analysis was good," she said. "The methodology walkthrough. You were good in there." "You were better," he said it plainly. 3 minutes and 19 seconds. The whole room. She looked at the room around them. People gathering their things, conversations happening in small clusters. Marcus fielding questions from 2 legal advisors. Patricia Osei standing near the window with the careful expression of someone who was already thinking about the next thing that needed doing. The room where, an hour ago, she'd put the truth in front of 63 people and let it stand on its own. "I need to call Dylan," she said. "He already knows. He's been watching a live feed from Marcus's office." Ethan's expression was dry. "Marcus set it up. He didn't mention it until 10 minutes ago." She thought about Dylan Marsh in the rental house 40 minutes outside the city, watching a screen, having waited 5 months for someone to look at the envelope under the sink. "Good," she said. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing about the aftermath of a major corporate fraud case ever was, and anyone who suggested otherwise hadn't been through one. The external investigation was thorough and slow, the kind of process that moved at its own pace regardless of everyone's preference, generating documents and requests and interviews in volumes that kept Marcus and his team occupied for months. The regulatory bodies involved had their own timelines. The legal proceedings against Brandon and the accident investigation firm moved through channels that required patience and specificity. But the shape of it was clear from the beginning. The evidence was what it was. Dylan's documentation, the metadata analysis, the original failure rate, Brandon's signature on the secondary review, the introduction to the accident investigation firm. Assembled, it was not a close case. It was the kind of case that resolved the way genuine evidence eventually resolved, regardless of the time it took. Brandon's attorneys attempted several alternative narratives. None of them held up against the server logs and the raw test files. In the final accounting, the altered certification data was confirmed, the accident investigation was found to have been influenced, and the acquisition structure was referred to regulatory authorities for separate review. Multiple people faced personal liability, and not only Brandon. 2 of his board allies had known enough and said nothing. The company survived. That had not been certain in the days when the story was coming out and the press was running it and the stock was doing what stocks did in that situation. There were 2 weeks in October that Sienna did not sleep well, watching the financial picture and making decisions about messaging and operational continuity and investor communication, doing the work that the work required. But the fundamentals were there. The actual products, the actual technology, the actual users who depended on Vantage Motion's equipment to move through the world. That was real, and it held. And eventually the markets processed the difference between a company whose leadership had committed fraud and a company that had caught and exposed it. The board offered Sienna her full operational role back in December. She accepted, with conditions. The conditions took 2 weeks to negotiate and were not entirely comfortable for anyone involved, which was how she knew they were right. She required an independent safety review board with genuine authority over product certification, not advisory, actual authority, with the power to halt development processes and require independent analysis before any product moved to external filing. She required that user representatives, actual users of Vantage Motion products, people who used wheelchairs and exoskeletons and assistive movement systems in their daily lives, sit on that safety board. She required transparent publication of all safety testing data, accessible to the public, because she had learned in specific and personal terms what happened when that data was held behind closed doors. The board pushed back on all three. She did not move. They negotiated the implementation details, and she moved on those. But the core of each condition she held. "You know this is going to slow down the product timelines," Owen Park told her in their final negotiation session. "I know," she said. "Investors are going to have questions about the development pace." "Then we'll answer them." She looked at him steadily. A chair with an 11.7% failure rate isn't a product. It's a liability and a harm. I built this company to make things that actually work for real people. If that takes longer, it takes longer. Owen looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. She signed the agreement on a Thursday, which felt appropriate. Ethan joined Vantage Motion in January as Director of User Experience. The title was accurate, but incomplete. What he actually did was sit at the intersection of engineering, safety, and the humans who would eventually use the products, and ask the questions that those intersections generated. He was good at it in a way that didn't surprise her. He'd been doing a version of it since the first time he'd looked at a demo video and said something underneath wasn't quite right. His first week, he reorganized his office 3 times. She watched this from her own office without comment. His second week, he attended a product review meeting and asked the engineering team 7 questions in 40 minutes that generated 3 action items and a fundamental redesign of 1 component. The engineering lead came to Sienna afterward and said, slightly reluctantly, "He's useful." "I know," she said. "Annoyingly useful." Also, yes, Lily, for the record, had opinions about her father's new office. She visited twice in the first month and both times rearranged the items on his desk into what she described as a better system. Ethan did not undo her arrangements after the second visit. Sienna noticed this and did not mention it. There were things between Sienna and Ethan that didn't have clean categories. The work was one of the easiest relationships she'd ever had professionally, the kind of working dynamic built on mutual directness, where disagreement was just a different form of conversation, and neither of them needed the other to be wrong in order to make a point. Outside work was less categorizable. They had dinner twice in January, once with Lily and once without, and the once without had been easy and good in a way that she turned over in her mind afterward without arriving at a conclusion. She was not someone who arrived at conclusions quickly about things that mattered. She'd learned the cost of moving fast on insufficient information. What she knew was that he'd shown up. Not in the easy way, not at the beginning, when everything was fine and showing up cost nothing. He'd shown up at the moment when what she was doing was risky and uncertain and likely to be complicated, and he'd stayed. That was not a small thing. She'd been in enough rooms with enough people to know exactly how rare that was. Dylan Marsh came back to Vantage Motion in February, not as an employee but as a consultant to the new safety review board. He'd kept the Denver job because he needed the stability and because Sienna hadn't asked him to leave it. But he came in twice a month and sat in safety review sessions and said the things he saw, and there was something in his posture in those meetings. Less of the braced quality she'd seen in the rental kitchen, more of a person who had found a place where saying what he saw was the job rather than a liability. She didn't tell him she was glad he'd kept the files. She showed it by making the thing he'd risked something worth having, risked. On a Tuesday evening in late March, the Safety Review Board held its first formal session in the new workshop space on the building's ground floor. A deliberate choice. away from the executive floor. A room with good light and actual workbench space where people could put things in front of them and look at them directly. Sienna had insisted on the workshop space for exactly that reason. She'd spent too long in rooms where things were described and represented rather than examined. She wanted a room where you looked at the actual thing. The session ran long. They always did, because the board took their mandate seriously, and there were always more questions than a single session could fully resolve. By 8 p.m., most of the board members had gone, and the room had thinned to a small group: Sienna, Ethan, Dylan, two of the user representatives who always stayed late, and the lead safety engineer, a woman named Rosa Kwan, who had joined the company in January and who had the particular quality of someone who had been waiting her whole career for a job that matched what she actually cared about. Ethan was at the workbench with Rosa, going over a sensor calibration question that had come up in the session. Sienna was at the table reviewing the meeting notes. Dylan was making coffee in the corner with the comfortable ease of someone who had been in a room enough times to know where the mugs were. She looked up at some point and took in the scene. The lit workshop, the workbench with its components laid out for examination, the specific comfortable noise of people who knew each other doing the work at the end of a long day. It was not a glamorous picture. It was a room with fluorescent lighting and coffee that had been brewing too long and papers spread across a table, and it was exactly what she had been trying to build for 10 years without knowing that this was what it looked like. Ethan looked up from the workbench and caught her looking at the room. He raised an eyebrow slightly, the question of what? She shook her head. Nothing. Everything. He went back to the sensor question. There was a moment, later in the evening, when the workshop had fully cleared and it was just the two of them, Sienna still at the table with her notes, and Ethan at the workbench finishing something. Lily had been picked up by the neighbor 2 hours ago and was, presumably, watching whatever she was currently watching on the better streaming setup. The building was quiet in the specific way it got after 8. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said. "Sure." "The birthday dinner." He didn't look up from the workbench. "If I hadn't wandered onto the wrong floor, if Lily hadn't needed the bathroom, and we hadn't gotten turned around, you would have sat there alone all night." "Probably," she said. "And then you would have gone to the office." "Yes." "And found the anomaly in the sensor data alone." She thought about it. "Eventually." "And you would have done all of this." He looked at her now. "With or without someone wandering in?" She considered the question seriously, because he'd asked it seriously. "I would have gotten here," she said. "It would have taken longer. I would have had fewer people I trusted while I was doing it." She looked at the workbench, at the components laid out in their careful order. "And I wouldn't have had anyone to remind me that burning the pasta is not a permanent condition." He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "Lily is never going to let that story go. She's not wrong to hold on to it. It's a good story." He picked up the sensor component he'd been examining and turned it over in his hand, the gesture of someone thinking through something physical. "She told me, on the drive home the night of the birthday dinner, that you seemed sad but also like you were thinking hard about something. She said those were the best kind of people." Sienna looked at him. "She said that? At 6? 6 and 2 weeks at that point." He set the component down. "She's been telling me things like that her whole life. I've learned to write them down." The city was outside the workshop windows, doing what the city always did, moving, lit, indifferent in the specific way that cities were indifferent, carrying its millions of separate stories at the same time without hierarchy. Somewhere in it, 40 people had gotten a cancellation email and gone on with their evenings without picking up a phone. And that was a fact about those relationships that Sienna had filed and processed and stopped using as evidence of her own worth. Some of those people had reached out after everything came out. Dana Feller had called in October, genuine and uncomfortable, and the call had been honest, if not warm, and she'd told Dana she appreciated it without pretending they were what they'd been before. Some things were smaller than they'd seemed. Some absences were information, and you used the information and moved on. What she had now was not what she'd planned the birthday dinner to announce. It was better. Not because it was perfect. It was very far from perfect, built on months of difficulty and a legal process that was still grinding through its channels, and a company that was still in the middle of rebuilding trust with its investors and users. Not perfect, but real in a way that the performance of the birthday dinner, The 40-place settings, the imported flowers, the room rented to say, "I'm still here" to people who'd needed to be convinced, had never been. She thought about what it meant that the worst night of that year had also been the beginning of everything that mattered in the year that followed. She didn't have a clean explanation for that. She wasn't sure clean explanations were useful most of the time. What she had was the experience of it. The birthday dinner that went empty, the wrong floor, the simple question, and then 6 days of working harder than she'd ever worked on something that mattered more than anything she'd ever worked on, alongside a person who had no reason to stay and had stayed anyway. There was something worth saying about that, about the way the things that ended up mattering rarely announced themselves when they arrived. The stranger in the doorway didn't look like anything except a father who'd gotten lost on the way to a birthday dinner. The manila envelope under the kitchen sink didn't look like anything except a scared former employee's contingency plan. The 4-3 vote that stripped her operational control didn't look like anything except a loss. And it was a loss. And also it was the moment that forced everything into the open, where it could finally be dealt with. There was something worth saying, too, about trust, about how it was not the same as familiarity, and how she had spent years confusing the two. Brandon had been familiar. She'd known his face her whole life, known his voice and his patterns and the specific way he tilted his head when he was thinking. That familiarity had stood in for trust in her accounting, and she'd never examined the substitution because she'd never had reason to. Until she did. Ethan had been a stranger. He still was, in many ways. She was still learning the territory of who he was, and he was still learning hers, and that was its own kind of work, slower and less certain than the documentation packages and the board presentations, but requiring its own form of attention. What she trusted in him was not familiarity. It was something she'd watched under pressure, the way he looked at things and told her what he actually saw, the way he stayed present in rooms that were difficult without making the difficulty about himself, the way he'd driven 40 minutes to a rental house and sat across from a scared man and asked the right question without needing to be the hero of the answer. You couldn't mistake that for something it wasn't. You couldn't manufacture it or schedule it or arrange it in a rented room with 40-place settings. It was just true, under pressure, which was the only condition that counted. She gathered her notes from the table. Ethan was putting the workbench in order, the careful habits of someone trained to leave a workspace ready for the next use. The workshop lights were warm. Outside, the city continued. "We should both go home," she said. "Yes." He picked up his jacket. "Lily has questions for you, by the way, about today's session. I made the mistake of explaining what a safety review board was." "What kind of questions?" "Detailed ones. She wants to know how you decide what's safe enough." He looked slightly apologetic. I may have underestimated her level of interest. Sienna picked up her bag. "Tell her I'll explain it to her properly, not a kid version." He looked at her. "She's 6. "She'll understand it," Sienna said. "She already does, probably. She just needs someone to use the real words." He held the workshop door for her as they went out. The small, automatic courtesy of someone who didn't make a production of courtesy, just did it. The hallway was quiet. The elevator took them down to the lobby, where the security desk had the overnight staff and the building was shifting into its quiet mode, the specific stillness of a place that would start up again in the morning. Outside, the air was cool and the street was lit and the city was going. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and felt it, the particular feeling of standing on solid ground after a long time on uncertain footing. Not triumphant, just steady, present, here. "Good night," Ethan said. "Good night," she said. He walked toward the parking structure. She turned toward the street where her car was waiting, and she thought about the workshop, about the sensor component on the workbench, about Rosa Kwan asking the questions that needed asking, about Dylan with his coffee in the corner, about the user representatives who stayed late because the work mattered to them personally, about the room full of fluorescent light and real work, and people who had chosen to be there. 40 chairs once, in a room that was set perfectly and attended by no one. 2 chairs pulled out by a stranger on a wrong floor because a 6-year-old wanted to sit at a fancy table on her birthday. Everything that followed had started in the second room and not the first. She had spent years trying to build something that looked impressive from the outside. What she had now was something that held up from the inside, which was not the same thing at all, and was so much harder to build, and was the only version that lasted. The city moved around her. She stood in it for a moment longer, then walked to her car and drove home through the lights.